Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Ghost Convoy That Passed Me in Silence, from Jimmy Torque. The interstate stretched out before me like a ribbon of black silk under the pale glow of a winter moon. And I had been driving for nearly 11 hours straight when I first saw them in my rearview mirror. It was somewhere past 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, that dead hour when even the most restless souls seem to find their peace, and the highway belonged to no one but the night itself, and those of us who made our living in its embrace. I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods from Kansas City to Denver, a route I had driven so many times I could probably do it with my eyes closed, though of course I never would. The road was empty that night, unusually so, with not a single pair of headlights visible in either direction for miles at a time. The only sound was the steady rumble of my diesel engine and the occasional crackle of static from my CB radio, which I kept on out of habit more than any real hope of hearing another voice. When the lights first appeared behind me, I felt a small flutter of relief, the kind that comes from knowing you are not entirely alone in the vastness of the American night. They were distant at first, just a faint glow on the horizon that grew steadily brighter as the minutes passed. I assumed it was another trucker, probably running late like me, pushing hard to make a delivery deadline. I eased off the throttle slightly, expecting the other driver to pull around me eventually, as most did when they were in a hurry. But the lights never seemed to get any closer, maintaining the same steady distance behind me no matter how much my speed varied. It was odd, I thought, but not alarming. Perhaps the driver was simply pacing me, content to follow rather than pass, finding some comfort in the presence of another vehicle on this lonely stretch of road. Then I noticed there were more lights. Not just one set, but several, strung out in a line behind me like beads on a string. I counted them in my mirror, squinting against the glare. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trucks in total, all following at exactly the same distance, all moving in perfect synchronization. It was like watching a military convoy, precise and disciplined, except there was something deeply wrong about it. The spacing was too perfect. The movement too synchronized, as if the trucks were all connected by invisible chains. I reached for my CB radio and thumbed the microphone, clearing my throat before speaking into the darkness. This is Jimmy Torque heading westbound on I-70, mile marker 243. Anyone out there running with me tonight? Static was my only answer. That familiar hiss and pop that filled the silence between human voices. I tried again, switching channels, calling out to the convoy that followed behind me. Breaker, breaker, this is the reefer heading west. You boys running together back there? Come back. Still nothing but static, and now the lights seemed closer, though I could not say exactly when they had moved. The temperature in my cab seemed to drop, and I found myself reaching for the heater controls, turning up the warmth even though I had been comfortable just moments before. My breath came out in small clouds now, visible in the dim light from my dashboard, and I realized with a creeping sense of unease that something was very wrong with this picture. Trucks don't travel in perfect formation like that. Not on public highways, not in the middle of the night. And drivers always answer their radios, always, because the loneliness of the road makes us hungry for connection. For the sound of another human voice cutting through the isolation, I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb from 65 to 70 to 75 miles per hour, pushing my rig faster than I normally would on an empty highway in the middle of the night. The convoy behind me matched my speed exactly, maintaining that same impossible distance, that same eerie precision. Then, without any warning or change in their formation, they began to pass me. The first truck pulled into the left lane and drew alongside my cab, and I turned my head to look at the driver, expecting to see a face, perhaps a wave or a nod of acknowledgement. But the cab was empty, completely, utterly empty. with no one sitting in the driver's seat, no hands on the wheel, no shadow or shape or suggestion of human presence. The truck was driving itself, cruising down the interstate at 75 miles per hour with absolute precision and no visible means of control. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared, unable to believe what I was seeing. And then the second truck pulled alongside the first, and it too was empty. Then the third and the fourth and the fifth, all of them passing me in perfect silence, not a sound reaching my ears despite the fact that we were traveling side by side at highway speeds. The cold in my cab was intense now, so cold that frost began to form on the inside of my windows, obscuring my view. I cranked the heater to maximum, but it seemed to have no effect whatsoever. The ghost convoy pulled ahead of me, and I watched as their taillights stretched into the distance, 5 sets of red lights fading into the darkness like embers dying in the night. And then as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, vanishing completely as if they had never existed at all. The highway was empty again, stretching endlessly before me, and the temperature in my cab slowly returned to normal. I checked my mirrors compulsively for the next hour, but I saw nothing, no lights, no trucks, no evidence that I had shared the road with anything at all. When I finally pulled into a truck stop near Salina to refuel and grab some coffee, my hands were still shaking. I asked the clerk if he had heard any reports of a convoy traveling westbound, but he just shook his head and gave me a strange look. It was only later, talking to another driver over breakfast, that I learned the truth. 20 years ago, almost to the day, 5 trucks had crashed on that exact stretch of highway during a winter storm, sliding off the road in formation and plunging into a ravine. All 5 drivers had been killed instantly, and according to local legend, they still run that route every year on the anniversary of their deaths. A ghost convoy traveling in eternal silence through the Kansas night, forever searching for a destination they will never reach. Story 2. The Empty Passenger Seat That Wasn't Empty, from Jackknife. Jerry, I have been driving trucks for more than 30 years, crisscrossing this great country of ours through every kind of weather and every season the calendar can throw at you, and in all that time I have seen things that would make most people question their sanity, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened to me on a fog-soaked night in the Great Smoky Mountains, when I learned that sometimes the emptiest spaces can be the most crowded, and that the passenger seat beside you is never really as empty as it appears. It was late October, that time of year when the leaves are falling and the nights grow long and cold, and I was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to Tennessee, taking the scenic route through the mountains because the main highway was closed for construction. The road wound through dense forest, climbing and descending in tight curves that required constant attention, and as the evening wore on, a thick fog rolled in from the valleys, reducing visibility to just a few yards in front of my headlights. I had the cab to myself, or so I thought, with nothing but my thermos of coffee and an old country station playing softly on the radio to keep me company. The passenger seat beside me was empty, had been empty since I left Charlotte that morning, just an expanse of worn vinyl in the indent where countless passengers had sat over the years, but none sat now. I remember glancing at it periodically, the way you do when you are alone for too long and start to feel the weight of solitude pressing down on you, almost wishing there was someone there to talk to help pass the miles and keep the exhaustion at bay. Be careful what you wish for, they say, because the universe has a twisted sense of humor when it comes to granting such casual desires. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was negotiating a particularly sharp curve, downshifting to maintain control as the fog pressed against my windshield like a living thing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement in the passenger seat, a subtle shift of shadow that made me turn my head sharply to look. The seat appeared empty, just as it had been all day, but I could have sworn I saw something. A darkness that was somehow darker than the surrounding darkness, a suggestion of form where no form should exist. I rubbed my eyes, blaming fatigue and the strain of staring into the fog for so many hours, and returned my attention to the road. But the feeling persisted. That crawling sensation on the back of your neck that tells you that you are being watched. That you are not alone even when all evidence suggests otherwise. Then I heard the breathing. It was soft at first, barely audible over the rumble of my engine and the whisper of tires on wet pavement. But it was unmistakably there, the slow, steady rhythm of someone drawing breath in and out, as if they were sleeping or resting peacefully in the seat beside me. I whipped my head around again, staring at the empty passenger seat with wide eyes, my heart beginning to race in my chest. There was no one there. The seat was empty, but the breathing continued, growing slightly louder, more present, as if whatever was making the sound was becoming more solid, more real with each passing moment. I reached out with one hand, keeping the other firmly on the steering wheel, and touched the passenger seat. It was cold, far colder than it should have been, cold enough that I pulled my hand back with a gasp, my fingers tingling from the contact. The temperature in the cab began to drop rapidly, and I watched in growing horror as frost began to form on the inside of the passenger window, spreading in delicate patterns across the glass like skeletal fingers reaching toward me. The breathing grew louder still, and now I could see it. Could actually see the condensation forming in the air above the passenger seat with each exhalation. Small clouds of vapor appearing and disappearing in rhythm with those phantom breaths. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and I forced myself to keep driving, to keep my eyes on the road even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to look, to see what was sitting beside me in that seat that wasn't empty anymore. And then it spoke. The voice was like wind through dead leaves, dry and papery and so faint I almost missed it beneath the sound of my engine. But the words were clear enough to stop my heart in my chest. I have been waiting so long for someone to stop. I nearly drove off the road, yanking the wheel at the last second to keep my rig on the pavement, my pulse thundering in my ears. I forced myself to look at the passenger seat, and for just a moment I saw her, a woman in a pale dress, her skin translucent in the dim light from my dashboard, her eyes dark and bottomless and filled with a sorrow so profound it made my chest ache just to witness it. She was looking at me, had been looking at me all along, and her lips were moving silently as if she was trying to tell me something desperately important, but could not find the breath to give her words sound. Then the fog outside suddenly cleared, just for a moment, and I saw the guardrail beside the road twisted and torn, marking the spot where a vehicle had crashed through years before and plunged down the mountainside. And I understood, with a clarity that was both terrible and absolute, that she had been a passenger in that vehicle, that she had died here on this curve, and that her spirit had been waiting ever since for someone to acknowledge her presence, to see her, to know that she had existed at all. I whispered, "I see you," my voice hoarse with fear and pity, and the temperature in the cab slowly returned to normal. When I looked at the passenger seat again, it was empty. Truly empty this time, with no trace of frost or shadow or sorrowful presence. But for the rest of that drive through the mountains, I could still feel her there beside me, a ghost keeping me company through the long night, a reminder that some passengers never really leave, even after their journey has ended. Story 3. The Woman in White Who Followed My High Beams from Diesel. Dave, the highway was a straight shot through the desert, one of those roads that seems to stretch on forever with nothing but sand and scrub, and the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the pavement like a lonely wanderer searching for someplace to call home. It was summer, the kind of brutal, unforgiving summer that turns the landscape into a furnace by day and leaves it strangely cold at night. And I was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Las Vegas, running late because of a delay at the warehouse and pushing harder than I probably should have been to make up the time. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the sky an impossible shade of deep purple that gradually faded to black, scattered with more stars than I had ever seen in my life, like diamonds thrown across velvet by some careless god. I had been driving for 6 hours straight when I first saw her in my headlights, A figure standing at the side of the road about 100 yards ahead, perfectly still and strangely bright against the darkness that surrounded her. She was wearing white. A long white dress that seemed to glow in the beam of my high beams, and her hair was long and dark, hanging loose around her shoulders and down her back. My first thought was that she must be in trouble. Maybe her car had broken down or she had been in an accident, and I began to slow down, preparing to pull over and offer assistance. But as I drew closer, something about the scene began to feel wrong, began to trigger alarm bells in the back of my mind that I could not quite explain. She did not move as I approached, did not wave, did not flag me down, did not turn to look at my truck bearing down on her. She simply stood there at the edge of the pavement, facing away from me, her white dress stirring slightly in a breeze I could not feel from inside my cab. I slowed to a crawl, pulling into the left lane to give her plenty of room, and as I drew level with her position, I looked out my window to see if she needed help. But when I looked, she was gone, just vanished, as if she had never been there at all, leaving nothing but empty desert and the ghost of an image burned into my retinas. I told myself I had imagined it, that fatigue and the hypnotic effect of staring at an empty highway for hours had played tricks on my mind, and I pressed on, accelerating back up to cruising speed. 10 minutes later, I saw her again. This time she was further down the road, perhaps 200 yards ahead, standing in exactly the same position, wearing the same white dress, her dark hair hanging just as it had before. My blood ran cold and my hands began to sweat on the steering wheel. This was impossible. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. No way she could be standing there when I had just seen her disappear into the desert miles back. I considered driving past without slowing, just blowing by her and pretending I had seen nothing. But something compelled me to slow down again, to look, to try to understand what I was seeing. And once again, as I drew level with her, she vanished, disappearing as completely and suddenly as before, leaving me shaking my head and wondering if I was losing my mind. It happened 7 more times over the next 30 miles. Each time she appeared further ahead, each time standing in the same position with her back to me, each time vanishing the moment I drew close enough to really see her. And each time, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger, a sense of dread that coiled in the pit of my stomach like a snake preparing to strike. I tried changing lanes, tried dimming my lights, tried speeding up and slowing down, but nothing made any difference. She was always there, always waiting in the beam of my high beams, a woman in white who should not exist but did, following my progress down that desert highway with an intentionality that was both deliberate and terrifying. On the 9th appearance, something changed. This time, when I drew close, she turned to face me. I saw her face clearly for the first time, illuminated in the harsh white light of my headlights, and I wish to this day that I had never looked. Her features were beautiful but wrong, like a painting that was almost perfect but contained some fundamental flaw that made it grotesque. Her eyes were too large, too dark, reflecting no light at all, and her mouth was set in an expression that might have been a smile, but looked more like a grimace of pain or sorrow. And then she raised one arm, pointing at something off to the side of the road, and I understood with sudden, absolute certainty that she was trying to warn me, trying to show me something I needed to see. I looked where she was pointing and saw them. A family broken down on the shoulder of the road, their hazard lights barely visible in the darkness, a father frantically waving his arms, a mother holding a small child. They had been there all along, but I had been so focused on the woman in white that I had nearly driven past without seeing them, nearly left them stranded in the desert night. I pulled over immediately, my heart pounding, and when I looked back for the woman in white, she was gone for the final time. I never saw her again, but I helped that family get to safety, and later learned that the area where they had broken down was known for fatal accidents. Cars drifting off the road in the darkness and tumbling down into ravines where they were not found for days or weeks. The woman in white, whoever or whatever she was, had saved their lives that night by making sure I could not ignore them, could not pass by without stopping. And though she frightened me beyond measure, I am grateful to her still, that ghost in the desert who followed my high beams and would not let me look away. Story 4. The radio station that played the dead from Big L. Every trucker knows the ritual of the radio, that constant search for companionship in the form of music or talk shows or weather reports, anything to break the monotony of mile after mile of empty highway stretching out before you like an accusation. I had been running the same route for 15 years, hauling freight from Memphis to Little Rock and back again. And I knew every radio station along that corridor the way some people know the names of their children. Could tell you which tower would start to fade and where to tune in for the next one before the static became unbearable. But on one particular night in early March, when the rain was coming down in sheets and the road was slick as glass beneath my tires, I found a station I had never encountered before, broadcasting on a frequency that should have been empty, and what I heard there changed everything. I thought I understood about the nature of reality and the boundary between the living and the dead. It was somewhere around midnight when my usual station faded into static, and I began spinning the dial looking for something, anything to fill the silence that pressed in around me like a physical weight. The rain hammered on my roof with relentless intensity, and visibility was reduced to just a few feet beyond my windshield despite the frantic work of my wipers. I was alone on the road, had not seen another vehicle for 20 minutes, and the isolation was beginning to wear on my nerves in a way that it usually did not. I needed voices, needed human connection, needed something to remind me that the world still existed beyond the small bubble of light that surrounded my truck. That is when I found it, tucked between two country stations on a frequency that I knew for certain had been silent for years. A clear, strong signal broadcasting what sounded like a jazz program from the 1940s, complete with scratchy recordings and a smooth-voiced announcer who spoke in the clipped formal tones of that long-gone era. I smiled at first, thinking I had stumbled onto some nostalgia station, someone's passion project bringing the music of a different age to night-shift truckers like myself. The songs were beautiful, haunting melodies played by orchestras that no longer existed, sung by voices that had been silent in their graves for decades. I settled back in my seat, letting the music wash over me, grateful for the company. But then the announcer said something that made my blood run cold. And now, he intoned in that precise, old-fashioned voice, a special dedication to Big Al, who is listening to us tonight on Highway 40, just past mile marker 127. This next song is for you, Al. Drive carefully in this rain. The roads are treacherous and we would hate to see you join us before your time. I nearly swerved off the road, grabbing the wheel with both hands and staring at the radio in disbelief. He had used my name, my road name that only other truckers knew, and he had identified my exact location with an accuracy that should have been impossible. I looked at my odometer and felt my heart skip. Mile marker 127 was less than a quarter mile ahead, appearing out of the rain-soaked darkness right on cue. The music that followed was unlike anything I had heard before, a slow, mournful piece that seemed to seep into my bones, filling me with a profound sadness that had no source and no name. And then the voices started, overlapping and whispering beneath the music. Dozens or perhaps hundreds of voices all speaking at once in a susurrus that reminded me of wind through a cemetery, or leaves rustling on forgotten graves. I could not make out individual words at first, just the general murmur of many people speaking, but gradually certain phrases began to emerge from the chaos, fragments of sentences that made terrible sense. I never saw the truck, died, instantly. They never found all of me. Still, looking for the way home, I realized with mounting horror that I was listening to the dead, to the voices of people who had been killed on this highway, broadcasting their stories and their sorrow into the night on a frequency that existed somewhere between stations, somewhere between worlds. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I reached for the dial to change the station to find something normal and living and real, but my fingers would not obey. The voices continued, growing louder, more insistent, and now I could hear individual stories. Brief glimpses into the final moments of people whose lives had ended in twisted metal and broken glass on this very stretch of road. A young woman's voice, scared and confused. "I don't understand why no one will stop. I have been waving for help for so long. Why won't anyone stop?" An old man, weary and resigned. "I thought I had another mile in me. Just one more mile. I was wrong." A child crying. "Mommy said we would be home soon. When are we going home?" Each voice was a knife in my chest, a burden of sorrow that I had not asked for but could not escape. And through it all, that smooth announcer's voice commenting on their stories as if he were hosting a radio show from hell itself. Yes, yes, such tragic tales we have for you tonight, dear listener. So many souls lost along this highway, so many dreams ending in darkness. But do not worry, Big Al. Your time has not yet come. Though it is closer than you think, I finally managed to twist the dial, wrenching it away from that cursed frequency with such force that I nearly broke it, and blessed static filled my cab, the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I drove the rest of that night in silence, not daring to touch the radio again. And when I finally pulled into a truck stop just before dawn, I was shaking so badly I could barely climb down from my cab. I asked other drivers if they had ever heard the station, described the frequency and the content, but they all looked at me like I had lost my mind. No one else had heard it, no one else knew what I was talking about. But 2 days later, I learned that there had been a massive pileup on Highway 40 that very night, at mile marker 134, just 7 miles past where I had been when the announcer warned me to drive carefully. 12 people died in that crash, their vehicles crushed and burning in the rain. I had driven past that spot less than an hour before it happened, guided by a warning from a radio station that should not exist, saved by the voices of the dead who did not want another soul to join their eternal broadcast. Story 5. The rest stop where everyone looked the same from moonlight. Mike, there are certain rest stops along the interstate system that you come to know like old friends. Familiar places where you can stretch your legs, grab a cup of coffee that tastes like burnt rubber, and use facilities that range from barely acceptable to downright frightening. I had been driving the southern routes for more than 20 years, and I thought I knew every rest area, every truck stop, every patch of pavement where a man could pull over safely between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But on a humid night in August, somewhere in the backwoods of Mississippi, I found a rest stop that I had never seen before. A place that appeared out of nowhere along a stretch of highway I had driven 1,000 times. And what I encountered there still haunts my dreams and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world we live in. It was approaching 3 in the morning when exhaustion finally caught up with me. That bone-deep weariness that comes from pushing too hard for too long. And I knew I needed to stop before I became a danger to myself and everyone else on the road. I had been fighting to keep my eyes open for the last 30 miles, slapping my face and blasting cold air from the vents. But nothing was working anymore. My body was demanding rest, and I had learned long ago that you do not argue with that particular demand unless you want to wake up wrapped around a guardrail or worse. I started looking for a place to pull over, scanning the roadside for the familiar blue signs that indicate rest areas and facilities. But this stretch of highway was dark and empty, with nothing but pine forest pressing close on either side. Then I saw it, appearing suddenly in my headlights as I came around a gentle curve. A rest area that I was absolutely certain had not existed the last time I drove this route, complete with parking spaces, picnic tables, and a small brick building that housed restrooms and vending machines. The sign welcoming travelers was weathered and faded, as if the place had been there for decades, but I had no memory of ever seeing it before. Still, I was too tired to question my good fortune, and I pulled off the highway with a sigh of relief, grateful for any place to rest my eyes for a few hours before continuing on to my destination. The parking lot was about half full, which surprised me given the late hour and the remote location. There were perhaps a dozen vehicles scattered across the spaces, A mix of cars and trucks and one large RV parked at the far end near the tree line. A few people were visible in the dim light from the overhead lamps, walking slowly between the vehicles and the restroom building. And I felt reassured by their presence. At least I would not be alone here in the middle of nowhere. And there is always safety in numbers, even if those numbers are just a handful of weary travelers seeking the same respite I was. I climbed down from my cab, stretching muscles that had been cramped in the same position for too long, and made my way toward the restroom building. That was when I started to notice something strange, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, even though I could not immediately identify what was wrong. The people I had seen moving around the rest area were all wearing similar clothing. Dark pants or jeans, plain shirts, nothing remarkable or distinctive, but the similarity was striking. And as I got closer, I realized they were not just dressed alike. They looked alike, eerily alike, as if they were all related or perhaps all cut from the same template by some cosmic assembly line. I passed a man standing near one of the picnic tables, and he turned to look at me as I walked by. His face was completely unremarkable. The kind of face you would forget the moment you looked away, with average features and no distinguishing characteristics whatsoever. He nodded at me politely, and I nodded back, but something about his eyes made me uncomfortable, a flatness that suggested nothing lived behind them, no personality or individuality or spark of human consciousness. I continued walking, and then I passed a woman heading in the opposite direction, and I had to do a double take because her face was identical to the man's. Not similar, not reminiscent, but exactly the same, as if they were wearing masks or as if they were copies of some original that I had not yet encountered. My heart began to beat faster, and I forced myself to keep walking toward the restroom, telling myself that I was imagining things, that exhaustion was playing tricks on my perception. But then I saw another person, and another, and they all had the same face, that same bland, forgettable collection of features that somehow became more disturbing the more times I saw it repeated. Men and women, young and old, all wearing different clothes but all sharing that identical face, moving through the rest area with slow, purposeful movements that reminded me of sleepwalkers or people moving underwater. I reached the restroom building and pushed through the door, desperate for a moment of privacy to collect my thoughts and convince myself that I was not losing my mind. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh and flickering, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the grimy mirror above the sink, and that was when I saw him standing behind me. The same face, the same flat eyes, but this time close enough that I could see there was something fundamentally wrong with the proportions. The features not quite sitting right on the skull, as if whoever or whatever was wearing that face did not quite understand how human anatomy was supposed to work. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. No one stood behind me. No one lurked in the stalls or near the door. I was alone, or at least I appeared to be alone. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, oppressive, like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the empty space where I had seen the figure, and then I ran, bursting out of the building and sprinting toward my truck with a speed I did not know I still possessed at my age. As I ran, I saw them all turning to look at me, every person in that rest area rotating in perfect synchronization to watch me flee. Their identical faces expressing nothing, revealing nothing, just observing my panic with that same flat, empty regard. I reached my truck and hauled myself up into the cab, slamming the door and hitting the locks with shaking hands. I fired up the engine without bothering to do any of my usual safety checks, without adjusting my mirrors or fastening my seatbelt, just desperate to get away from that place and back onto the highway where things made sense and people had different faces. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw them all standing in a line watching me leave. Perhaps 24 identical figures arranged like a chorus line at the edge of the pavement, and then the rest area was gone, swallowed by the darkness behind me. And when I looked back again, there was nothing there but empty highway and dense forest pressing close on either side. I drove without stopping for the next 6 hours, fueled by adrenaline and terror. And when I finally felt safe enough to pull over at a normal, well-lit truck stop with normal, different-faced people, I asked about the rest area I had seen. No one knew what I was talking about. According to everyone I spoke to, there was no rest area on that stretch of highway, had never been a rest area there, and the maps agreed with them. But I know what I saw, and I know what I escaped from that night, and I have never driven that route again, choosing instead to take longer detours that add hours to my journey, but keep me away from that place where everyone looked the same. Story 6. The truck wash that trapped me inside from crankshaft. Carl, cleanliness might be next to godliness, as my mother used to say, but there are some places where the pursuit of a clean vehicle can lead you into territory that has nothing to do with divinity and everything to do with something much darker and more ancient than any religion could explain. I learned this lesson the hard way on a spring evening in rural Indiana, when I made the mistake of pulling into an automated truck wash that looked perfectly normal from the outside, but turned out to be something else entirely. Something that wanted to keep me and my rig inside its mechanical embrace forever, washing away not just the dirt and grime of the road, but something more essential, something that made me who I was. I had been hauling a load of agricultural equipment through 3 states of mud and rain, and by the time I reached the outskirts of Indianapolis, my truck was so filthy that I could barely see out the windows. The dirt was caked on in layers, each one representing a different county or different weather system I had driven through, and I knew I needed to clean it off before I made my delivery the next morning. No one wants to receive freight from a truck that looks like it has been driven through a swamp, and appearances matter in this business, matter more than most people realize. So when I saw the sign for the automated truck wash just off the interstate, gleaming and new-looking in the fading light of evening, I did not hesitate to pull off and follow the arrows directing me toward the entrance. The facility was impressively large, much bigger than the typical truck washes I was accustomed to, with a long tunnel-like structure that could easily accommodate the largest rigs on the road. There was no attendant visible, just a payment kiosk where I could swipe my credit card and select the level of service I wanted. I chose the deluxe package, figuring my truck deserved the full treatment after everything it had been through, and the machine cheerfully accepted my payment and instructed me to proceed forward into the wash tunnel. The massive doors at the entrance slid open with a hydraulic hiss, and I eased my truck forward, following the guide rails that would keep me centered as the machinery did its work. The doors closed behind me with a heavy thud that seemed too final, too permanent, but I told myself I was being paranoid. This was just an automated wash, nothing more, nothing less. The kind of thing I had been through dozens of times before. The lights inside the tunnel were bright, almost painfully so, reflecting off white tile walls that seemed to extend much further than they should have given the external dimensions of the building. And then the water started, powerful jets erupting from every direction, hammering against my truck with a force that was just slightly more aggressive than comfortable, making the whole rig shake and shudder with the impact. The brushes descended next. Enormous rotating cylinders covered in bristles that began to scrub at my truck with mechanical precision. I watched them through my windshield, mesmerized by their rhythmic motion, and that was when I noticed that they were not just cleaning the dirt away. They seemed to be scrubbing too hard, removing not just grime but paint, taking the finish down to bare metal in long strips that gleamed wetly under the harsh lights. I felt a spike of alarm and looked for a way to signal that I wanted to stop. Wanted to exit the wash before it stripped my truck down to nothing, but there was no emergency button visible in the cab, no cord to pull, no way to communicate with the machinery that was methodically destroying my vehicle's exterior. I tried to shift into reverse, thinking I could back out of the tunnel, but my transmission would not respond. The gear shift moved freely, clicking from position to position, but nothing changed, as if the connection between the controls and the actual mechanics of my truck had been severed. I was stuck, trapped inside this mechanical nightmare, watching helplessly as the brushes continued their work, now reaching parts of the truck that should not have been accessible, appearing beside my windows and scrubbing at the glass with a determination that went beyond any normal cleaning cycle. The water turned strange colors as it ran off my truck. First red like rust or blood, then black like oil, then other colors I had no names for, hues that seemed wrong somehow that hurt to look at directly, and the sound of the wash changed, the mechanical whirring and spraying giving way to something else, something that sounded almost organic, like breathing or chewing or the wet sounds of digestion. The white tile walls around me began to pulse, expanding and contracting rhythmically, and I realized with mounting horror that I was not inside a building at all, that I had driven into something alive, something that was trying to process me and my truck like food, breaking us down into component parts. The brushes began to reach into my cab through vents and seams I did not know existed, bristles probing like fingers or tongues, touching my arms and face with a sensation that was both tickling and burning at the same time. I tried to push them away, but there were too many, and they kept coming, kept reaching, kept scrubbing at my skin as if trying to remove me layer by layer. I screamed, though I knew no one could hear me over the roar of the water and the mechanical grinding that filled the air, and I watched in the mirror as my truck began to literally come apart behind me, panels peeling away and falling into the churning water below, revealing the frame and then the spaces beyond the frame, empty voids that should not have existed. Time became meaningless inside that tunnel. I might have been there for minutes or hours or days, trapped in an endless cycle of washing and scrubbing and dissolving, feeling myself coming apart at the seams just like my truck. And then, just when I thought I could not endure another moment, when I was certain that I would be completely consumed by whatever this place really was, the machinery stopped. The brushes retracted, the water ceased, and the exit doors at the far end of the tunnel slowly began to open, revealing the parking lot beyond and the blessed normalcy of the evening sky. I did not wait for permission or instruction. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, and to my surprise, the truck responded, lurching forward and racing toward the exit with a speed born of pure terror. I burst out of the tunnel and kept going, not stopping until I was back on the interstate and miles away from that place. Only then did I pull over and climb down to inspect the damage, expecting to find my truck stripped and ruined, barely recognizable as the vehicle I had driven in. But there was nothing wrong with it. Not a scratch, not a dent, not a missing panel. It was clean, spotlessly clean, cleaner than it had been when it first came off the factory floor, but otherwise completely intact and undamaged. I stood there for a long time, staring at my truck and trying to understand what had happened, trying to reconcile the horror of what I had experienced with the evidence before my eyes. And then I noticed one small detail that confirmed I had not imagined it all. My reflection in the polished chrome of my bumper was slightly wrong, the features not quite arranged the way they should be, as if I had been taken apart and put back together by something that did not quite understand how humans were supposed to look. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could see it, and I see it still every time I look in a mirror. The truck wash had taken something from me that night, some essential piece of myself, and replaced it with something close but not quite right. And I have never used an automated wash since, preferring to clean my truck by hand slowly and carefully, in the open air where nothing can trap me and nothing can take away any more pieces of who I am. Story 7. The face in my side mirror. That wouldn't blink from gritty Gus, they say. That objects in your mirror are closer than they appear. A warning that has been printed on the passenger side mirrors of vehicles for as long as anyone can remember. But no one ever tells you what to do when the object in your mirror should not be there at all. When it appears impossible and stays visible no matter how fast you drive or how many times you look away and look back, hoping desperately that it will be gone. I learned about this particular horror on a cold November night, when I was hauling timber through the mountains of West Virginia, navigating roads that twisted and turned like the thoughts of a madman. And I saw something in my side mirror that made me understand that some things once seen can never be unseen. And some passengers will ride with you forever, whether you want them to or not. The load I was carrying was heavy, old-growth logs destined for a specialty mill that would turn them into expensive furniture for people who could afford to pay premium prices for wood that had been growing since before their grandparents were born. The weight made my truck handle differently, more sluggish on the turns, slower to accelerate, and I was taking it easy through the mountain passes, not wanting to risk losing control on roads that were already treacherous even in good conditions. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible and your joints ache, and the stars above were sharp and bright against the black canvas of the sky, indifferent to the struggles of the creatures crawling along the roads below. I had been driving for about 3 hours when I first noticed something in my side mirror. It was just a flicker at first, a suggestion of movement that caught my eye but did not fully register in my conscious mind. I glanced at the mirror, a quick check to see what was beside me or behind me, and that was when I saw the face. It was pressed close to the glass, close enough that I could see every detail despite the darkness, close enough that I could make out the texture of the skin and the way the lips were slightly parted as if about to speak. But what made my blood run cold was the eyes, or rather, the fact that they were not blinking, just staring with an intensity that was both fixed and somehow searching, looking at me or through me or into some dimension that intersected with mine only in the reflection of that mirror. I jerked my head around, looking directly at the space beside my truck where the face should have been, but there was nothing there. Just empty road and dark forest pressing close on either side. I looked back at the mirror, and the face was still there, still staring, still not blinking. My heart began to hammer in my chest, and I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a reflection of something inside my cab, or a shadow cast by passing clouds. But the sky was clear, and there was nothing in my cab that could create such an image. And besides, the face was too detailed, too specific, too real to be a simple trick of light and shadow. I focused on the road, trying to ignore the mirror, telling myself that if I just did not look, the face would eventually go away. But ignoring it was impossible. The image burned in my peripheral vision, demanding attention, and every time I tried to focus on something else, my eyes would drift back to that mirror and that face still there, still staring, still refusing to blink. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20, and the face never changed, never moved, never blinked. It just watched me with those unblinking eyes, and I began to feel that I was not just being watched but being evaluated, studied, examined by something that wanted to understand me in ways I did not want to be understood. I tried adjusting the mirror, angling it away so I could not see the reflection, but no matter how I positioned it, the face remained visible, as if it existed not in physical space but in some other dimension where the laws of geometry and perspective did not apply. I even reached out and touched the mirror's surface, half expecting my fingers to pass through it into whatever space that face occupied. But the glass was solid and cold, completely normal in every way except for what it showed me. The mountain road began to climb more steeply, and I had to shift down to maintain speed, the engine growling with effort as we ascended through switchbacks that offered spectacular views during the day, but were just expanses of darkness now, dotted with the occasional light from a distant farmhouse or passing vehicle. And through it all, the face watched, never blinking, never changing expression, just maintaining that steady, unwavering gaze that began to feel less like observation and more like accusation, as if I had done something wrong, something terrible, and this was my punishment, to be watched forever by eyes that never closed. Then the face did something that made everything worse. It smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a warm or reassuring expression, but something twisted and knowing, as if it had discovered a secret about me that I did not know myself. And the eyes, those terrible unblinking eyes seemed to grow brighter, more intense, reflecting light that had no source. I could not stand it anymore. I pulled over at the first wide spot in the road, bringing my truck to a stop and killing the engine, plunging everything into sudden silence broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and my own labored breathing. I sat there in the darkness, not daring to look at the mirror, and tried to think, tried to figure out what was happening and what I should do about it. Was I hallucinating? Had I been drugged somehow? Was this some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by too many hours alone on the road? But I felt fine otherwise, my mind clear and sharp, no other signs of confusion or impairment. This was real, whatever it was. As real as the steering wheel under my hands and the seat beneath me. Finally, I gathered my courage and looked at the mirror again, slowly turning my head, almost afraid of what I would see. The face was still there, but something had changed. It was closer now. Impossibly close, as if it had been moving toward me incrementally all along, closing the distance between us with infinite patience. And now I could see that there was something wrong with the face beyond just the unblinking eyes and the disturbing smile. The proportions were not quite right. The features arranged in a way that was almost human but not quite, like a mask made by someone who had heard humans described but never actually seen one. And then it spoke. I could not hear any sound, but I saw the lips move, saw the words forming, and somehow I understood them as clearly as if they had been whispered directly into my ear. I was right behind you all along. I looked in my rearview mirror, my regular mirror that showed the road behind me, and there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint red glow of my own taillights reflecting off the pavement. But when I looked back at the side mirror, the face was laughing now, silently, joylessly, and I understood that whatever it was, wherever it had come from, it had chosen me for reasons I would never understand, and it would be there in my mirror from now on, watching and waiting and never ever blinking. I started my engine and pulled back onto the road, and I drove through the rest of that night with my eyes fixed straight ahead, never looking at the side mirror again, though I could feel that unwavering gaze on me every second, every mile. When dawn finally broke and the sun rose behind the mountains, I allowed myself one more glance at the mirror. The face was gone, vanished with the darkness, but I knew it was not really gone, just waiting for the next night, the next stretch of lonely road, the next moment when I would be alone and vulnerable. And I was right. It comes back sometimes on certain nights when the conditions are right. That face in my side mirror that will not blink, reminding me that some things see us more clearly than we see ourselves, and some watchers never stop, watching no matter how much we wish they would just close their eyes and let us pass by unseen. Story 8. The Shadow That Sat on My Trailer from Heavy Haul. Henry, there is a weight to shadows that most people never consider, a substance that goes beyond the simple absence of light and touches on something more fundamental, more real, than the objects that cast them. I learned this truth the hard way during a month-long haul across the northern states, when I picked up a shadow somewhere in the Dakotas that decided to ride along with me, perched on top of my trailer like a hitchhiker that I never invited and could not persuade to leave, growing heavier and more oppressive with each passing mile until I began to wonder if the weight I was carrying was measured in pounds or in something else entirely, something that had no name in any language. I knew the job itself was straightforward, at least on paper. I was hauling oversized equipment, massive industrial machinery that required special permits and escorts through certain states, the kind of load that turns heads and makes other drivers give you plenty of space on the highway. The pay was excellent, as it always is for heavy haul work, but the job demanded patience and precision, careful navigation through routes that had been planned down to the last mile to avoid low bridges and tight turns. I had been doing this kind of work for 15 years, and I knew the challenges and the risks, knew how to distribute weight properly and how to compensate for the way a heavy load affects your handling and stopping distance. Everything was normal for the first week of the journey. The weather was good, the equipment was secure, and I was making better time than expected. I stopped at a small truck stop in South Dakota to refuel and grab some food, and that was where it must have happened, where the shadow found me and decided to come along for the ride, though I did not notice it immediately. Looking back, there were signs I should have recognized. Small things that did not quite add up, but that I dismissed at the time as fatigue or imagination, or the natural oddness that comes from spending too much time alone on the road. The first sign was the way other drivers started looking at my rig when I pulled into rest areas or truck stops. They would stare at the trailer, their expressions troubled or confused, and some would actively avoid parking near me, choosing spots farther away, even when there was plenty of space available. I thought maybe my load looked more unstable than it actually was, or perhaps I had picked up some road grime that made the rig look poorly maintained. But when I inspected the trailer myself, everything looked fine. The chains tight, the equipment secure. Nothing obviously wrong or concerning. The second sign was the weight. My truck started handling differently, becoming sluggish and unresponsive in ways that did not match the load I was carrying. I knew exactly how much weight I was hauling, had the paperwork to prove it, but the truck felt like it was carrying far more, straining on hills that should have been easy, braking distances extending beyond what they should have been. I had the rig weighed at a certified scale, thinking maybe there had been an error in the original loading, but the numbers came back exactly as expected. The weight on paper was correct, but the weight on the road was something else entirely. It was on the 10th night of the journey, when I pulled into a rest area somewhere in Minnesota, that I finally saw it. I had parked and climbed down from my cab to do my routine inspection, before settling in for some sleep, and as I walked around the trailer, checking connections and looking for any signs of wear or damage, I happened to glance up at the top of the load, and there it was, sitting cross-legged on the highest point of the machinery I was hauling. A shadow. Not the shadow cast by something else, but a shadow that existed on its own. A darkness that was deeper and more complete than the normal shadows created by the absence of light. It was shaped roughly like a human figure, but wrong in all the subtle ways that made it impossible to mistake for an actual person. Too tall and too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that human joints cannot achieve. I stood there staring, my breath catching in my throat, and the shadow seemed to notice my attention. It turned what might have been its head toward me, though it had no face that I could see, no features at all, just that deep, absolute darkness. And then it settled more firmly into its position, as if getting comfortable, making it clear that it had no intention of leaving. I felt the weight increase in that moment, felt it press down on the trailer and through the trailer into the frame of my truck and into the road itself, as if the shadow had substance, had mass that increased exponentially when it was being observed. I tried everything to get rid of it. I drove under bright lights thinking that intense illumination might dispel it the way it does normal shadows. I pulled into truck washes and let the water and chemicals spray over the top of my load, hoping to wash it away like dirt or grime. I even climbed up onto the trailer myself, armed with a broom, and tried to sweep at the shadow, though what I expected to accomplish, I cannot say. Nothing worked. The shadow remained, sometimes shifting positions slightly but never leaving, always present on top of my load like a dark passenger that I had never invited but could not evict. The weight continued to increase, day by day, until I was struggling to maintain highway speeds even on flat terrain. My truck burned through fuel at twice the normal rate, the engine working overtime to move a load that should not have been that difficult. And the shadow grew too, I think, becoming larger and more distinct, or perhaps I was simply becoming more attuned to its presence, more able to perceive its true nature and extent. At night, when I tried to sleep in my bunk, I could feel it up there above me, could sense its weight pressing down through the layers of metal and machinery, a reminder that I was not alone, that something had attached itself to me and my rig and was feeding on something I could not name. Other drivers began to avoid me actively, and at truck stops I would hear whispers, see people pointing at my rig and making signs I did not recognize. Warning gestures perhaps, or symbols meant to protect against evil. No one would talk to me directly about what they saw, but their reactions made it clear that the shadow was visible to others, that I was not simply hallucinating or experiencing some kind of breakdown. Whatever rode on my trailer was real enough for other people to see and fear, and their fear made my own fear that much worse. The weight became almost unbearable as I approached the delivery point, my truck barely able to move, the engine screaming in protest with every mile. I felt that weight in my bones, in my joints, in my head, a pressure that was both physical and psychological, crushing me down as surely as it was crushing my truck down into the pavement. And then finally I reached my destination, pulled into the industrial yard where the equipment was to be unloaded, and waited while the crew prepared their cranes and machinery to take my cargo away. The moment the first strap was loosened, the moment the equipment began to lift free from my trailer, I felt the weight vanish, just gone, instantly, as if it had never been there at all. I looked up at the top of my trailer, and the shadow was gone too, disappeared into the daylight, or perhaps transferred to something else, some other unfortunate carrier who would not notice it at first, just as I had not noticed it. My truck felt light, impossibly light, as if I could fly if I just pressed the accelerator hard enough, and I drove away from that place as quickly as I could, grateful to be free of the burden I had carried, but knowing, somehow, that shadows like that are always waiting, always looking for the next ride, the next host, the next person foolish enough or unlucky enough to give them a place to perch and grow heavy, and turn a simple job into a nightmarish journey through weight that should not exist. Story 9. The Dispatcher, who died last week from lonely. Luke communication is the lifeline of the trucking industry, that invisible thread connecting drivers scattered across thousands of miles to the dispatchers who coordinate their movements, assign their loads, and serve as their primary contact with the company and the world beyond the highway. I had been working with the same dispatcher for 7 years, a woman named Margaret, who had a voice like warm honey and a patience that never seemed to wear thin no matter how many complaints or problems I brought to her attention. She knew my roots, knew my preferences, knew when I needed encouragement and when I needed to be left alone to work through whatever challenges the road threw at me. So when she continued to call me and assign me loads for an entire week after I learned she had died, I began to question everything I thought I understood about the boundaries between life and death, and the obligations that bind us even after we have supposedly been released from all earthly duties. It was a Monday morning when I got the call that changed everything, though at the time I did not know how significant that conversation would become. I was finishing up a delivery in Oregon, preparing to head to my next pickup, when my phone rang with the familiar number from dispatch. I answered automatically, expecting Margaret's cheerful greeting, her usual question about how I was doing and whether I had encountered any problems with the current load. And that is exactly what I got. Her voice coming through clear and strong, asking about my progress and informing me that she had a new assignment ready for me if I was interested. A straightforward haul from Portland to Salt Lake City with a generous delivery window. We talked for perhaps 5 minutes, covering all the usual details about weight, cargo type, pickup times, and delivery schedules. She sounded perfectly normal, perhaps a bit tired, but nothing that raised any alarms in my mind. I accepted the load, thanked her for looking out for me, and ended the call feeling good about the next leg of my journey. It was not until 3 hours later, when I pulled into the truck stop to refuel before heading to the pickup location, that I learned the truth. I was standing in line at the checkout counter when I overheard 2 other drivers from my company talking in low, somber tones about a tragedy that had occurred over the weekend. Margaret, our dispatcher, the woman I had just spoken to that morning, had been killed in a car accident on Saturday night. She had been driving home from a family gathering when another vehicle ran a red light and struck her car broadside, killing her instantly. The funeral was scheduled for Wednesday, and the company was planning a memorial service for the following week. I stood there frozen, my mind refusing to process what I was hearing because it was impossible, completely impossible. I had just talked to her. I had heard her voice clear as day, discussing routes and loads and schedules with the casual professionalism that was her trademark. I approached the other drivers and asked them to repeat what they had said, hoping desperately that I had misheard or misunderstood, but they confirmed every detail, pulling out their phones to show me the company-wide email that had been sent out on Sunday morning, announcing Margaret's death and expressing condolences to her family. There was her photograph, smiling at the camera, and the dates of her birth and death, the latter being 3 days before the conversation I had just had with her. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet, felt reality become something flexible and uncertain, something that could not be trusted to follow the rules I had always believed were immutable. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and checked my call history. There it was. A call received that morning from the dispatch number, duration 5 minutes and 17 seconds, exactly as I remembered. I had not imagined it, had not dreamed it, had not hallucinated the entire conversation. The evidence was there in my phone's memory. Cold digital proof that something impossible had occurred. I called the dispatch number immediately, and a man answered, someone I did not recognize, introducing himself as the temporary dispatcher, who was filling in while the company worked on finding a permanent replacement for Margaret. I asked him about the load to Salt Lake City, and he seemed confused, telling me there was no such assignment in the system. No record of anyone having contacted me that morning. I should have been frightened, should have been alarmed and disturbed by this supernatural intrusion into my ordinary life, but instead I felt a strange sense of peace. Margaret had always taken care of me, had always made sure I had good loads and reasonable schedules, and apparently, death had not changed her commitment to doing her job well. If her spirit was still working dispatch, still looking out for the drivers she had worked with in life, then I would accept her help gratefully, even if it came from beyond the grave. The calls continued throughout that week. Every morning around the same time, my phone would ring with the dispatch number, and Margaret's voice would come through warm and professional, discussing loads and routes and schedules as if nothing had changed, as if she were still sitting in her office chair instead of lying in whatever resting place her body had been consigned to. And I would listen, taking notes, accepting assignments that somehow always turned out to be legitimate even though they were never recorded in the company system until after I completed them. Other drivers started reporting similar experiences. Late-night calls from Margaret checking on their progress, offering encouragement when they were struggling, providing route advice that saved them from traffic jams or road closures that they would otherwise have driven into blindly. The temporary dispatcher, whose name was Frank, began to notice the pattern of mysterious assignments that completed themselves, loads that appeared in the system only after they had been picked up and delivered, all associated with drivers who had worked closely with Margaret. He started asking questions, investigating these phantom assignments, trying to understand how we were getting information that was not coming through official channels. Some of us told him the truth, told him that Margaret was still dispatching from whatever office exists on the other side of death, but he looked at us like we were crazy, like we were playing some kind of elaborate prank at the company's expense. I attended Margaret's funeral on Wednesday, standing in the back of the chapel while her family and friends said their goodbyes, sharing stories of her kindness and dedication and the way she always put others before herself. And that night, alone in my truck at a rest area in Nevada, my phone rang again. I answered it, and Margaret's voice came through softer than usual, almost whispering. "Thank you for coming today, Luke. It meant a lot to me to see you there. I know this must be confusing, but I have a few more loads to assign before I can rest. Will you help me finish my work?" What could I say to that? How do you refuse a request from someone who has died, but cannot seem to stop caring, cannot seem to stop fulfilling the responsibilities they held in life? I told her I would take whatever assignments she had, would help her complete whatever unfinished business was keeping her tethered to this world. And for the next 3 days, I hauled loads that she assigned me, following routes that she planned, delivering cargo that materialized in my trailer through means I did not question and did not want to understand. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after her death, my phone rang one final time with the dispatch number. Margaret's voice came through, but it sounded distant now, fading as if she were calling from very far away or through a connection that was failing. "This is my last one, Luke. After this, I can go. Thank you for helping me. Thank you for not hanging up when you learned the truth. Drive safely and take care of yourself." The line went dead before I could respond, and when I tried to call back, the dispatch number just rang endlessly without anyone answering. The final load took me to a small warehouse in Montana, a place I had never delivered to before and would never deliver to again. As I was unhitching my trailer, an elderly man came out of the office and approached me, his face solemn and knowing. "You are one of Margaret's drivers, aren't you?" he asked, and I nodded, not sure how he knew. He explained that Margaret was his daughter, that she had worked for this family business before moving on to the larger trucking company, and that she had always felt guilty about leaving him short-handed, always worried that she had abandoned him when he needed her most. This final delivery, he told me, was a shipment that had been pending for months, equipment that his business desperately needed but that had been delayed repeatedly due to logistics problems and scheduling conflicts. Margaret had promised him she would find a way to get it delivered, and apparently, she had kept that promise even after death. I never received another call from Margaret after that day. The dispatch number was reassigned to Frank permanently, and life returned to something resembling normal. Though I never forgot that week when the boundary between life and death became permeable, when duty and dedication proved stronger than the grave. Other drivers who had worked with Margaret reported similar experiences, a gradual tapering off of the phantom calls until they stopped entirely, as if she had finally finished all her unfinished business and could rest at last. But sometimes, late at night when I am driving through empty stretches of highway, with no other lights visible in any direction, my phone will buzz with a notification even though no call or message appears on the screen. And I like to think it is Margaret checking in on me one more time, making sure I am safe and on schedule, still looking after her drivers even from whatever distant shore she finally reached when her work was done. Story 10. The gas pump that bled from roadkill. Ray fuel is the lifeblood of the trucking industry, the essential commodity that keeps the wheels turning and the cargo moving. And every driver develops relationships with certain truck stops and fuel stations, places where they know the pumps are reliable, and the fuel is clean and the prices are reasonable enough not to make you feel like you are being robbed at gunpoint. I had been stopping at the same independent truck stop in rural New Mexico for nearly a decade, a family-owned operation that treated drivers with respect and maintained their equipment properly. Always a clean restroom and hot coffee and fuel that never gave my engine problems. So when the gas pump started bleeding during what should have been a routine fuel stop, I knew immediately that something was terribly wrong, that some boundary had been crossed or some curse had been invoked, and that the simple act of filling my tank had become something dark and dangerous and wrong. It was late afternoon when I pulled off the interstate, my fuel gauge showing less than a quarter tank remaining. Enough to get me another 100 miles perhaps, but not worth the risk when a known good fuel stop was right there. The place looked exactly as it always did. A small cluster of buildings surrounded by desert, the kind of establishment that has survived for decades through honest dealing and word-of-mouth recommendations from drivers who appreciate quality and reliability. Old Joe, the owner, was visible through the window of the office, and he waved to me as I pulled up to the diesel pumps. A familiar gesture that made me feel welcome and safe. I shut down my engine and climbed out, stretching my legs and back, enjoying the dry desert air after hours in my climate-controlled cab. The fuel pump was one of the older models, mechanical rather than digital, the kind that clicks and whirs as it measures out each gallon. A comforting sound that speaks of simpler times before everything became computerized and complicated. I swiped my fuel card, removed the nozzle from its cradle, and began the process of filling my tanks. a process I had performed thousands of times before without incident or concern. The first indication that something was wrong came when I noticed the color of the fuel flowing through the transparent section of the pump hose. Diesel fuel is normally a clear or slightly amber liquid, clean and oily, but what I was seeing was darker, thicker, more viscous than it should have been. I frowned and leaned closer, thinking perhaps the fuel was contaminated, maybe mixed with old oil or water that had collected in the bottom of the storage tank. But as I watched, the liquid flowing through the hose became progressively darker and redder, taking on a color and consistency that was sickeningly familiar, that reminded me of nothing so much as blood, fresh blood flowing from a wound. I released the pump trigger immediately, stepping back from the nozzle as if it had become a snake. But the fuel continued to flow for several seconds more, thick red liquid spurting from the end of the nozzle and splashing onto the concrete around my truck. It was blood. Unmistakably blood. I could smell it now. That distinctive copper scent mixed with something darker and more corrupt, like meat that had been left to rot in the sun. My stomach heaved, and I had to turn away, pressing my hand over my mouth to keep from vomiting right there on the pump island. When I looked back, the flow had finally stopped, leaving a pool of dark red liquid spreading across the concrete, thick and viscous and utterly impossible. I stared at it, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were clearly showing me. And then I heard the sound of the pump itself, a wet gurgling noise like someone drowning, like lungs filling with fluid and trying desperately to expel it. The mechanical clicking and whirring that I found so comforting had been replaced by organic sounds of biological processes that no machine should ever make. I ran to the office, bursting through the door with enough force to make old Joe jump up from his desk in alarm. "Something is wrong with pump 4, I gasped out, pointing back toward my truck. "It is not pumping fuel, it is pumping blood, and I don't know what is happening, but you need to shut it down right now." Joe looked at me like I had lost my mind, but he grabbed his tools and followed me back outside, muttering under his breath about heat stroke and drivers who push themselves too hard in the desert sun. But when we reached the pump, when he saw the pool of red liquid spreading across the concrete and smelled that unmistakable copper scent, his expression changed from skepticism to horror. He approached the pump cautiously, reaching out to touch the liquid with one finger, then bringing it up to examine it more closely. His face went pale and he wiped his hand on his jeans as if trying to remove something contaminated. "That is blood," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "That is human blood. But that is impossible. That is absolutely impossible." He opened the access panel on the pump, exposing the mechanical components inside, and we both recoiled from what we found. The inside of the pump was filled with biological material, tissue and veins, and what looked like fragments of organs, all pulsing wetly with some kind of horrible life. It was as if something living had been forced inside the machinery, had been integrated with the metal and plastic and electronics in ways that defied all logic and reason. Blood was seeping from dozens of small tears and ruptures in this grotesque biological material, pooling in the bottom of the pump housing and leaking out through the fuel lines. Old Joe slammed the access panel shut and ran back to the office, and I heard him on the phone calling someone, maybe the police or maybe a repair service, his voice rising in pitch as he tried to explain what we had found. I stood there beside my truck, staring at the blood spreading across the concrete, and noticed that it was moving wrong, flowing in patterns that did not match the slight grade of the pavement, swirling and eddying as if guided by some intelligence or purpose. And then I saw shapes forming in the blood, letters or symbols that I did not recognize but that filled me with a deep, instinctive dread, as if my lizard brain understood their meaning even though my conscious mind could not interpret them. Other drivers started to arrive, pulling up to the other pumps to fuel their own vehicles, and I tried to warn them away, tried to tell them that something was wrong, and they should go somewhere else. But they looked at the pump I had been using and saw nothing unusual, just a normal diesel pump with a small puddle of what looked like ordinary fuel on the ground. The blood was invisible to them, Or perhaps it was only visible to me, I could not tell which. They filled their tanks without incident, gave me strange looks as they drove away, and I was left standing there wondering if I was going insane, if the isolation of the road had finally broken something in my mind. Old Joe came back outside, and I could see from his expression that whoever he had called had not believed him, had probably suggested he seek medical attention or take a vacation, but he believed what he had seen. I could tell that much, and he was frightened in a way that I had never seen him frightened before. "I am shutting down Pump 4, he told me. "Not just for today, permanently. I am going to have it torn out and replaced. And I am going to have the storage tanks inspected and cleaned, and if anyone asks why, I am going to tell them it was a contamination issue and leave it at that." I finished fueling at a different pump, using one on the opposite side of the station, as far from Pump 4 as I could get, and the fuel that came out was normal. Clean diesel with the right color and the right smell, and no hint of anything organic or wrong. But I could not shake the image of what I had seen, could not stop thinking about the biological material inside the pump, the way it had pulsed and bled like something alive and suffering. Before I left, I asked Old Joe if anything unusual had happened recently, any accidents or incidents that might explain what we had witnessed. He was quiet for a long moment, then told me that a drifter had been found dead behind the station about a week earlier. A man with no identification who appeared to have died of natural causes or perhaps an overdose. The police had taken the body away, but they never identified him, never figured out where he had come from or why he had been there. And about 2 days after the body was removed, Pump 4 had started acting strangely, the flow rate irregular, the fuel smelling slightly off, small problems that Joe had attributed to normal wear and tear on old equipment. I drove away from that truck stop knowing I would never return, knowing that some places become tainted by death or suffering in ways that cannot be cleaned or repaired, only avoided. And for the rest of that day and long into the night, I could not stop thinking about that drifter, wondering if his spirit had somehow become trapped in that fuel pump, trying desperately to communicate through the only means available, pumping his own essence through those mechanical veins in a macabre parody of life, bleeding out endlessly in the desert sun while drivers came and went, most of them never seeing what I had seen, never knowing that they were standing beside something that should not exist, a gas pump that bled human blood and wept for a death that no one mourned. Story 11. The Passenger Who Asked for a Ride Home. From Tim. The unwritten rules of the highway are simple and clear. You do not pick up hitchhikers. You do not stop for strangers in distress unless you are calling for proper help, and you absolutely never, under any circumstances, allow someone into your cab whose story does not make sense or whose presence triggers that primal warning system that evolution gifted us for recognizing danger. I had followed these rules religiously throughout my career, turned away countless people who stood at the sides of roads with their thumbs out and their desperate expressions, hardened my heart against sympathy, because sympathy can get you killed or robbed or worse in this business. But on a rainy October evening in Louisiana, I broke my own rules, picked up a passenger who asked for a ride home, and learned that sometimes home is not a place you can reach by driving, and sometimes the passengers who most need help are the ones who have already made their final journey and simply refuse to believe it is over. The rain was coming down in torrents when I saw him, a figure standing at the side of the road with his arm outstretched, not quite thumbing for a ride, but clearly signaling that he needed assistance. I would have driven past without a second thought, my usual policy firmly in place, but something about the scene nagged at me, something that made me ease off the accelerator and take a closer look as I approached. The man was soaking wet, his clothes plastered to his body, and he was not standing in the way you would expect a hitchhiker to stand. Not with that casual confidence or aggressive desperation that characterized most people looking for rides. Instead, he looked confused, almost lost, turning his head from side to side as if he could not quite figure out where he was or how he had gotten there. Against my better judgment, against every instinct and rule I had developed over decades on the road, I pulled over, I told myself I would just ask if he needed me to call someone, if there was a local number I could dial to send help his way, but I would not actually let him in my truck. That was the line I would not cross, the boundary that would keep me safe from whatever trouble this situation might bring. But when I rolled down my window and looked at him more closely, when I saw the expression on his face, lost and frightened and desperate for any kind of human connection, I found myself unlocking the passenger door and gesturing for him to climb in. He moved stiffly, like someone who was injured or exhausted beyond measure, and collapsed into the passenger seat with a sigh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep in his chest, somewhere that had been holding that breath for far too long. Up close, I could see that he was younger than I had initially thought, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and ordinary features that would have been completely forgettable under other circumstances. His clothes were old-fashioned, I noticed. Not in the trendy vintage way, but genuinely old. Like something from the 1970s or early 80s, faded denim and a button-up shirt with a collar style that had not been popular for decades. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse and quiet. "Thank you for stopping." No one else would stop. They all just drove past, and I have been standing there for so long. I was starting to think I would never get home. I asked him where home was, reaching for my GPS to see if I could take him at least part of the way, and he gave me an address in a small town about 40 miles down the road, a place I would pass through anyway on my route. It seemed simple enough, an easy good deed that would not cost me much time or trouble, and I pulled back onto the highway feeling better about breaking my rules, feeling like maybe this was one of those rare situations where helping a stranger was the right thing to do. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the drumming of rain on the roof and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers fighting to keep the glass clear. I glanced at my passenger periodically, noticing small details that struck me as odd but not quite alarming. He was not shivering despite being soaked to the skin, was not leaving wet spots on the seat the way someone fresh from the rain should have been. His hands were folded in his lap and they were very pale, almost translucent in the dim light from the dashboard, with blue veins visible beneath the skin in patterns that seemed wrong somehow. "Too prominent or too numerous? How long have you been out there?" I asked, trying to make conversation, trying to understand his situation better. He turned to look at me and I saw that his eyes were strange, the pupils too large, the color too uniform, like someone whose eyes had been drawn rather than grown. "I am not sure," he said slowly, as if the question confused him. "I was driving home from work and then there was the rain, so much rain I could not see, and then I was standing by the road and my car was gone and I just need to get home. My wife will be worried. She worries when I am late." Something about his answer troubled me, some note of disconnect between his words and the reality of the situation. But I could not quite put my finger on what was wrong. I asked him what kind of work he did, where he had been coming from, simple questions meant to establish his story and reassure myself that he was who he claimed to be. But his answers were vague, evasive, as if he could not quite remember the details of his own life. He worked in manufacturing, he thought, or maybe it was construction. He had been at his job, or perhaps running an errand, or maybe visiting someone, he was not entirely sure. The town he had named was approaching, visible through the rain as a cluster of lights in the distance, and I asked him to direct me to his specific address. He pointed vaguely ahead, telling me to take the next exit and then follow the main road through town, and I complied, leaving the highway and navigating the smaller streets of a place that looked like time had forgotten it existed. The buildings were old, many of them shuttered or abandoned, and the few businesses that remained open had a dated, worn appearance that spoke of economic decline and population loss. "Turn here," he said, indicating a residential street lined with small houses, most of them dark despite the early hour. We drove slowly down the street, and he pointed to a house on the right, a small ranch-style home with a neat lawn and a car in the driveway. "That is it," he said, and there was such relief in his voice, such joy at finally being home, that I felt my own tension ease slightly. I pulled up in front of the house and put my truck in park, and he reached for the door handle with hands that still looked too pale, too strange. "Thank you," he said again. "Thank you for bringing me home. I knew someone would stop eventually. I knew I would get home." He climbed down from the cab, moving with that same stiff, awkward gait, and I watched as he walked up the driveway toward the front door. But instead of knocking or reaching for keys, he simply stood there, staring at the house as if he could not quite figure out how to proceed. I was about to call out to him, to ask if he needed help, when the front door opened and a woman appeared, elderly and frail, peering out into the rain. She looked at the spot where my passenger stood, looked right at him or through him, and called out, "Who is there? Is someone there?" And then I realized that she could not see him. She was looking directly at where he stood, but her eyes were not focusing on him, were not registering his presence at all. He reached out toward her, his expression desperate, and she shivered suddenly, wrapping her sweater more tightly around her shoulders. "Just the wind," she muttered, and closed the door, leaving him standing alone in the rain that did not seem to touch him, staring at a house he could not enter. I climbed down from my truck, walking toward him with my heart hammering, knowing now what he was, what he had been all along. "You can't go in, can you?" I said quietly, and he turned to face me, and his expression was one of such profound loss that it made my chest ache. "I just want to go home," he whispered. I was so close, and then the rain and the road, and everything went dark. And now I am here, but I cannot get inside, cannot make her see me, cannot explain that I am sorry I am late. I stood there in the rain while he told me his story, or the fragments of it that he could remember. He had been driving home in a storm much like this one, more than 40 years ago. The roads had been slick, visibility nearly zero, and he had lost control of his vehicle, sliding off the road and into a ravine where his car had been crushed, and he had died instantly. But he had been so close to home, just miles away from his wife and the life they were building together, and his spirit had refused to accept that the journey was over, had continued trying to reach home long after his body had been recovered and buried. "She is still here," he said, nodding toward the house. "My wife, she never remarried, never moved away. She has been waiting for me all these years, though she does not know it, does not remember me consciously, but I see her sometimes at the window, looking out like she's expecting someone, and I know she is waiting for me to come home." I asked him what I could do, how I could help him, and he just shook his head. "You already helped," he said. "You stopped when everyone else drove past. You listened to me, saw me, brought me as close to home as I can get. That is more than most people would do, more than I had any right to hope for." And then he was fading, becoming transparent, his form dissipating like smoke in the rain, and the last thing I saw was his smile, sad but genuine. The expression of someone who had finally been acknowledged, finally been seen after decades of invisibility. I stood there alone in the rain, staring at the empty space where he had been, and then I climbed back into my truck and drove away, leaving that small house and that patient widow behind me. I later learned, through research I probably should not have done, that a man matching my passenger's description had indeed died in a car accident on that highway in 1981, just miles from that very house, survived by a young wife who never remarried and spent the rest of her long life in that same home, waiting perhaps for a husband who never made it home from work one rainy night. And I understood then that some journeys end before we reach our destinations, but the desire to complete them, the need to go home, can persist beyond death, beyond reason, beyond any boundary we think exists between here and whatever comes next. Story 12. The Woman Who Crawled Out of My Sleeper from Red Light. Randy, the sleeper berth is sacred space for a long-haul trucker, the only private territory in a life lived largely in public. The small compartment behind the driver's seat where exhausted bodies can find rest and troubled minds can briefly escape the endless responsibility of keeping a 40-ton vehicle safely on the road. I'd been sleeping in various truck cabs for more than 15 years, had learned to fall asleep anywhere under any conditions, and had never once felt unsafe or threatened in that small private space that was mine and mine alone. But on a winter night in Iowa, when the temperature had dropped well below zero and the wind was howling across the frozen fields with a sound like lost souls searching for shelter, I learned that even the most private spaces can be invaded, that locks and walls provide no protection against certain kinds of visitors, and that the worst nightmares are the ones that greet you when you wake up rather than disturbing your sleep. I had pulled into a rest area around midnight, too tired to continue driving safely, my eyes burning from staring at white snow swirling in my headlights for hours on end. The storm had intensified throughout the evening, visibility dropping to nearly zero, and the smart thing to do was to park and wait for conditions to improve, rather than risk sliding off the road or crashing into another vehicle that I could not see until it was too late. The rest area was nearly empty, just 2 other trucks parked at the far end and no cars visible anywhere. Most sensible travelers having decided to wait out the storm in the comfort of hotels rather than vehicles. I went through my usual routine before settling down to sleep, checking that my doors were locked, setting my alarm for 6 hours ahead, arranging my blankets and pillow in the cramped space of the sleeper berth. The wind rocked my truck gently, and the cold pressed against the windows, but inside I was warm and comfortable, cocooned in familiar surroundings that had become a second home over the years. I fell asleep quickly, dropping into that deep, dreamless state that comes from physical exhaustion and mental fatigue, the kind of sleep that should have left me refreshed and ready to face another day on the road. I do not know what woke me. Some sound or presence that my subconscious registered as wrong, even before my conscious mind had fully emerged from sleep. I opened my eyes slowly, reluctant to abandon the warmth of sleep for the cold reality of the winter night. And that was when I saw her. She was crawling out of the storage space beneath my mattress, emerging impossibly from a compartment that was far too small to contain a human body, squeezing through an opening that should not have been able to accommodate anything larger than a small dog. Her movements were wrong, joints bending in directions that human joints should not bend, limbs extending far beyond their normal length as she pulled herself up and into my sleeper berth. I could not move, could not scream, could not do anything but lie there frozen in horror, as this impossible figure continued to emerge from the storage space that should have contained nothing but spare clothes and emergency supplies. She was thin, impossibly thin, her skin pulled tight over bones that protruded at sharp angles, and her hair hung in wet, tangled strands around a face that was both beautiful and grotesque. Features that might have been lovely in life but were now distorted by death or madness or something worse than either. Her eyes, when they found mine, were completely white, no iris or pupil visible, just blank white orbs that somehow conveyed more intelligence and malevolence than any normal human gaze. She smiled at me, and I saw that her teeth were too sharp, too numerous, crowding her mouth in rows like a shark's teeth, designed for tearing and rending rather than the gentle work of human chewing. And she began to speak, her voice like wind through broken glass, words that I could not quite understand but that filled me with a terror so profound that I felt my bladder release. Warm urine spreading across my pants and the bedding beneath me, a humiliation that barely registered against the overwhelming fear that had taken control of every nerve and muscle in my body. She continued to pull herself out of the storage compartment, her body seeming to fold and unfold in ways that defied geometry and physics, more and more of her emerging from a space that should not have been able to contain even a fraction of her mass. And as she came, she reached toward me with hands that had too many fingers, appendages that ended in long curved nails that looked more like claws than anything human. I tried to move, tried to scramble backward toward the cab of my truck where there might be some escape route or some weapon I could use to defend myself, but my body refused to obey, muscles locked in place by fear or perhaps by something else, some force that she was exerting over me that paralyzed my will as effectively as it paralyzed my limbs. She was fully in the sleeper berth now, crouched at the foot of my bed like some grotesque predator preparing to pounce. and I could smell her. A scent of decay and earth and something chemical that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. She tilted her head to one side, studying me with those white, terrible eyes, and then she spoke again. And this time I could understand the words, though I wished desperately that I could not. "You are sleeping in my bed," she said, her voice carrying notes of accusation and proprietary anger. "This is my space. You have no right to be here." And then the memories came flooding back. Fragments of stories I had heard from other drivers, whispered tales around truck stop coffee counters about a woman who had died in a sleeper berth, murdered by a driver who had picked her up thinking she was just another lot lizard looking to make some money, but who had fought back when he tried to strangle her after refusing to pay, a body that had been hidden in the storage compartment beneath the mattress and not discovered for weeks. The truck continuing to make deliveries across multiple states while her corpse decomposed in the darkness below, where drivers slept, unaware of the horror that lay just inches beneath them. This was her, or what remained of her, the spirit that had been trapped in that truck and then somehow dispersed across the fleet, when the vehicle was finally decommissioned and its parts distributed to other trucks for salvage and reuse. And she was angry, so angry, filled with a rage that death had not diminished but had instead amplified and focused, searching for someone to blame, someone to punish for the injustice of her murder and the indignity of her disposal. "I am sorry," I managed to whisper, finding my voice at last, though it came out cracked and weak. "I am so sorry for what happened to you, but I did not hurt you. I was not the one who killed you. I am just a driver trying to make a living and get home safely." She regarded me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then slowly, she began to retreat, folding herself back down into that impossible space, her limbs compacting and her body contorting until she fit back into the storage compartment that had become both her tomb and her prison. But before she disappeared completely, before the last of her withdrew into the darkness beneath my bed, she looked at me one more time and spoke a final warning. "Sleep somewhere else tomorrow night. This bed is mine and I am tired of sharing it with the living." And then she was gone, vanished completely, leaving only the faintest scent of decay and the memory of her white, accusing eyes. I did not sleep again that night. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the engine on for heat, and sat there shivering until dawn broke and the storm finally cleared enough for me to drive away. And I reported what had happened to my company, told them that my truck needed to be checked, that there was something wrong with the sleeper berth that made it unsafe to use. They humored me, sent the vehicle to a maintenance facility, and found nothing wrong. No trace of anything unusual or supernatural, just a normal truck with normal components that had been salvaged from dozens of other vehicles over the years, a patchwork of parts that carried no history and no curse. But I refused to sleep in that truck again, requested a different vehicle, and took the disciplinary action that came from being difficult and demanding, rather than risk another encounter with the woman who crawled out of my sleeper. And I learned that the spaces we think of as private, as ours, as safe, are never truly any of those things. That walls and locks and doors are illusions that provide comfort but no real protection, and that sometimes the dead refuse to rest, refuse to forgive, refuse to relinquish the spaces where they suffered and died, claiming them forever as their own regardless of who the living thinks has the right to be there. Story 13. The Dead Deer That Looked Back at Me from Cabbage Hill. Carl, the highway is a graveyard for animals, a killing field where thousands of creatures meet their end each year, beneath the wheels of vehicles that cannot stop in time or simply do not bother to swerve. And every driver who has spent any significant time on the road has seen more roadkill than they care to remember. Deer, raccoons, possums, dogs, cats, birds of every description, all reduced to broken shapes at the side of the pavement. Their deaths so common and unremarkable that most of us barely register them anymore. Just another feature of the landscape like mile markers or exit signs. But on a foggy autumn morning in Pennsylvania, driving down a mountain grade that truckers call Cabbage Hill for reasons lost to history, I hit a deer that refused to stay dead. that looked back at me with eyes that held far too much intelligence and accusation. And I learned that some deaths are not endings but transformations, and some creatures continue their journey long after their bodies have been destroyed. The fog that morning was dense and low-lying, hugging the road surface like a living thing, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 feet in front of my truck. Despite my headlights cutting through the gray murk with all the power my electrical system could provide, I was descending Cabbage Hill carefully, riding my brakes and staying well below the speed limit, knowing that this particular stretch of road had claimed more trucks than I cared to count. Steep grades and sharp curves combining with unpredictable weather to create conditions that could turn deadly in an instant. The transmission was in low gear, engine providing most of my braking power, and I was hyper alert, watching for any obstacles or hazards that might appear suddenly out of the fog. The deer came from nowhere, or perhaps it had been standing in the road all along and I simply had not seen it through the fog. A massive buck with a full rack of antlers that gleamed wetly in my headlights for just a fraction of a second before I struck it. There was no time to brake, no time to swerve, no time to do anything but brace for impact as several hundred pounds of animal met several tons of truck in a collision that should have been instantly fatal for the deer. I felt the thud through my steering wheel, heard the sickening crunch of bone and the sound of my grill cracking under the impact. And then the deer was gone, swept beneath my truck or thrown to the side of the road, its fate sealed in that terrible moment of contact. I should have kept driving. That is what most drivers do when they hit an animal, especially a deer. You cannot stop for every creature that throws itself in front of your truck. Cannot perform funeral rites for every life that ends beneath your wheels. The deer was dead, certainly dead after being struck by a vehicle my size at that speed. And stopping would accomplish nothing except delay my delivery and create a hazard for other vehicles coming down the mountain through the fog. But something made me pull over, some instinct or compulsion that I did not fully understand, and I eased my truck onto the shoulder about 100 yards past the point of impact, engaging my hazard lights and climbing down from the cab to inspect the damage. The front of my truck was worse than I expected. The grille cracked and pushed in, one headlight shattered, and there was blood streaking across the chrome and paint, dark and thick in the gray morning light. I walked back along the shoulder, looking for the deer's body, expecting to find it in the ditch or at the edge of the tree line, broken and still like every other piece of roadkill I'd ever seen. But there was nothing. No body, no blood trail, no sign of the deer except for a few tufts of brown fur caught on a piece of my truck that had been torn loose in the impact. I stood there confused, trying to understand how a deer that I had definitely hit, that I had felt the impact from, that had left physical evidence of the collision on my truck, could simply vanish without a trace. And then I saw it, standing in the fog about 30 yards away, right in the middle of the road where I had hit it. The buck was intact, seemingly uninjured, its magnificent antlers held high and proud, and it was looking directly at me with eyes that reflected my headlights in the unnatural way that animal eyes do. That eerie green glow that makes them seem alien and otherworldly. But something was wrong with those eyes, wrong in a way that went beyond simple reflection or the angle of the light. They held intelligence, human-level intelligence, and more than that, they held knowledge, awareness, understanding of exactly what had happened and what it meant. The deer should have been dead, should have been lying broken at the side of the road, but instead it stood there watching me, and I felt the weight of its gaze like a physical pressure against my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to do anything but stare back at this impossible creature that should not exist. I took a step toward it, not sure what I intended to do, perhaps to verify that it was real, that I was not hallucinating from fatigue or stress or some kind of delayed shock from the accident. But as I moved, the deer moved too, taking a step toward me, closing the distance between us with deliberate intent. And I saw then that it was not quite right, that there were things wrong with its body that became more visible as it approached. One of its legs bent at an unnatural angle, broken but still supporting weight. Its ribcage was collapsed on one side, creating a concave depression where solid muscle should have been. And there was blood matting its fur. Fresh blood still dripping onto the pavement beneath it, leaving a trail that steamed in the cold morning air. It was dead. The deer was dead, killed by the impact with my truck, but it was still moving, still walking, still approaching me with that terrible intelligence burning in its eyes. I backed away, my own feet moving without conscious instruction from my brain, animal instinct taking over where reason had failed, telling me to run, to flee, to get away from this thing that was dead but would not lie down, that refused to accept the ending that should have been final and absolute. The buck followed me, matching my pace, maintaining the distance between us at exactly 30 yards, and I realized with growing horror that it was hurting me, driving me back toward my truck with the same kind of patient, inexorable pressure that predators use to guide their prey into killing positions. But the deer was not a predator, or at least it should not have been, and I was not prey, or at least I should not have been. But in that moment, all normal categories and definitions had ceased to have meaning, and I was simply a human being pursued by something that should have been dead but was not. Something that wanted something from me, though I could not guess what. I reached my truck and scrambled up into the cab, slamming the door and locking it, and the buck stopped exactly where it had been, still maintaining that precise distance, still watching me with those knowing, accusing eyes. And then it spoke. I know that is impossible. The deer cannot speak, do not have the vocal apparatus or the cognitive capacity for human language, but I heard it as clearly as I have ever heard anything in my life. A voice that came not through my ears but directly into my mind, bypassing the normal channels of sound and perception. You took my life, it said. And the voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something ancient and fundamental, the voice of nature itself speaking through the broken body of this creature that I had killed. You took my life without thought, without malice, but also without care, without consideration for what I was or what I meant to the world that I inhabited. And now I ask you, what will you give in return? What payment will you make for the life that ended beneath your wheels? I did not know how to answer, could not form words even if I had known what to say, could only sit there trembling behind the steering wheel of my truck, while this dead thing that would not die demanded payment for a death I had not intended and could not undo. I had killed animals before, of course, dozens of them over the years, unavoidable casualties of a career, spent driving hundreds of thousands of miles, across roads that cut through habitats and migration routes and territories that had belonged to wild creatures long before humans decided to pave them over. But I had never thought about it, never considered the weight of those deaths or what they meant to anything beyond my insurance rates and repair bills. I am sorry, I finally managed to whisper, though I knew the words were inadequate, meaningless in the face of what had been taken. I am sorry I killed you. I did not want to, did not mean to, could not stop in time. I am sorry. The buck regarded me for a long moment, its head tilting to one side in a gesture that might have been consideration or might have been mockery, and then it spoke again, its mental voice softer now, less angry but no less intense. Your sorrow is noted but changes nothing. I am still dead, still removed from the world I knew, still separated from the herd and the forest and the life I should have continued living. But I will accept your acknowledgement as partial payment. The rest you will carry with you, a weight you cannot see but will always feel. A reminder that every action has consequences, and every death diminishes the world in ways we rarely stop to consider. And then the buck turned away from me, its broken body moving stiffly through the fog, limping on legs that should not have been able to support any weight, heading toward the tree line and the forest beyond. I watched it go, unable to look away, and as it reached the edge of the trees, it looked back at me one final time, those intelligent eyes meeting mine across the distance, and then it was gone, melting into the fog and the forest as if it had never existed at all. I sat in my truck for nearly an hour after that, unable to move, unable to process what I had witnessed, unable to reconcile the impossible events with any rational explanation. Eventually, I started my engine and continued down the mountain, driving more slowly, more carefully than I ever had before, seeing the road and the forest on either side with new eyes, eyes that now recognized that the spaces between the pavement and the trees were not empty, were not just scenery or obstacles to be navigated around, but were filled with life, with creatures whose existences had value and meaning that had nothing to do with human purposes or priorities. And I carry that weight still, just as the deer promised I would. A burden that cannot be measured or quantified, but that I feel every time I see an animal at the side of the road, every time I pass over ground where something died beneath wheels that could not or would not stop. The dead deer that looked back at me taught me that death is not always an ending, that some things refuse to die quietly, refuse to fade away without leaving a mark on the world and the people who caused their demise, and that the price we pay for our carelessness is not always calculated in dollars or damage, but in something more profound, more permanent, more personal than any financial transaction. Story 14. The Truck Stop Clerk Who Never Blinks from Mudflap. Marty truck stops are strange ecosystems where the normal rules of society seem suspended, places where people from every walk of life converge briefly, before dispersing back onto the highways that spread across the country, like veins carrying blood through a body. And the clerks who work behind the counters of these establishments see more humanity in a single shift than most people encounter in a lifetime. They develop a certain look, these perpetual observers of the transient, a watchfulness that comes from dealing with exhausted drivers and desperate hitchhikers and people running from or toward something they never quite explain. But the clerk I encountered at a truck stop in Nebraska possessed a watchfulness that went beyond professional awareness, an unblinking attention that suggested something fundamentally wrong with the person behind that counter, something that made me question whether I was dealing with a human being at all, or something else wearing a human shape like an ill-fitting suit. It was 3 a.m. when I pulled into the truck stop, a national chain location that looked identical to 1,000 others scattered across the interstate system, bright fluorescent lights reflecting off wet pavement and the smell of diesel and coffee and industrial cleaning products mixing together in a scent that every trucker knows intimately. I needed fuel and food and a bathroom, the holy trinity of truck stop visits, and I expected the usual interaction with a bored clerk, counting the hours until their shift ended, making small talk or no talk depending on their personality and how busy the place was. The clerk behind the counter was a woman, or appeared to be a woman, perhaps 40 years old with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and a name tag that read Sharon pinned to her uniform vest. She was standing perfectly still when I entered, not leaning against the counter or organizing merchandise or doing any of the small tasks that people do to pass time during slow periods, just standing there with her hands at her sides and her face turned toward the door, as if she had been waiting specifically for me to arrive. "Good morning," I said, heading toward the coffee station to pour myself a cup of something that would probably taste like burnt motor oil, but would at least provide caffeine and warmth. She did not respond, did not acknowledge my greeting in any way, just watched me with an intensity that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle with unease. I glanced at her as I poured my coffee, trying to catch her eye, trying to establish some kind of normal human connection, and that was when I noticed that she was not blinking. Her eyes were fixed on me, tracking my movements with perfect precision, but her eyelids never closed, never performed that unconscious action that humans execute thousands of times per day without thought or awareness. I told myself I was imagining things, that she had probably blinked and I had simply missed it. But as I moved around the store gathering snacks and supplies, as I spent 5 full minutes browsing the aisles and making my selections, she never once broke her gaze and never once blinked. Her eyes remained wide open, staring at me with an unwavering attention that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing, like being watched by a predator or by something studying me for purposes I could not fathom. When I approached the counter to pay for my items, I deliberately looked away, fixing my attention on my wallet as I pulled out my credit card, hoping that if I did not make eye contact, the situation would feel less uncomfortable. But I could feel her stare, could sense those unblinking eyes fixed on me. And when I finally looked up to hand her my card, she was even closer than she should have been, having leaned forward across the counter without making any sound, her face now just inches from mine. "You are traveling far tonight," she said, and her voice was wrong, too flat and too measured, like someone reading from a script or like speech, synthesized by a computer that had not quite mastered the nuances of human intonation. "The roads are dangerous when the hour is late and the darkness is deep. Many travelers do not reach their destinations when they journey in the spaces between midnight and dawn." I pulled back slightly, disturbed by her proximity and by the strange quality of her words, which sounded less like casual conversation and more like a warning or perhaps a threat. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to keep my tone light and casual. "Been driving nights for 20 years. The darkness and I are old friends." She tilted her head to one side, a gesture that might have been human if it had not been so precise, so mechanical, like a bird examining something curious or a robot, calculating the meaning of an unexpected input. "Friends," she repeated as if testing the word, determining whether it applied to the situation. "Yes, perhaps friends, or perhaps something else, something that waits in the darkness, patient and hungry, watching for those who travel alone through spaces where no one will hear them scream or disappear." The temperature in the store seemed to drop several degrees, and I realized that we were completely alone. No other customers visible, no other employees appearing from the back rooms or the restrooms, just the two of us in this brightly lit space that suddenly felt very small and very isolated despite being part of a major truck stop complex. I looked toward the windows, hoping to see other people, other trucks, signs of normal activity. But the glass reflected only the interior of the store, showing me my own face and the clerk behind the counter, still unblinking, still staring with that terrible focus that made me feel like a specimen under examination. "I should get going," I said, reaching for the credit card machine to complete my transaction, wanting nothing more than to escape this interaction and get back to my truck where I could lock the doors and convince myself that I had simply encountered someone strange rather than something dangerous. But she placed her hand over mine, stopping me from taking my card, and her skin was cold, far colder than any living humans should be, cold enough that I gasped and tried to jerk my hand away. "Wait," she said, and now there was something different in her voice, some quality that might have been urgency or might have been hunger. "I have a question for you, traveler. What do you see when you look at me? Do you see a person, a clerk working the night shift at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere? Or do you see something else? Something that wears a person's shape but is not a person? Something that exists in the spaces between what is real and what is possible?" I stared at her, my mind racing, trying to understand what she was asking and why, trying to determine if this was some kind of bizarre test or if I was in actual danger. Her hand was still on mine, still cold, and I could see now that there was something wrong with her eyes beyond the lack of blinking, something about the color or the depth that made them look less like organs of sight and more like windows into vast, empty spaces where nothing human had ever existed or could ever survive. "I see someone who should probably take a break," I said finally, forcing a smile that I did not feel. "Night shifts are hard. Maybe you need to step outside, get some fresh air, rest your eyes." She considered this for a moment, her head tilting again in that mechanical way, and then slowly, deliberately, she blinked. It was not a normal blink, not the quick, unconscious closing and opening of eyelids that humans perform constantly, but a slow, controlled movement that took several full seconds to complete, her eyes disappearing behind flesh that looked too thick and too pale to be human skin. When her eyes opened again, something had changed. The intensity was gone, replaced by a more normal expression. Confused and slightly embarrassed, as if she was waking up from a trance or recovering from some kind of episode. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was different now too, more natural, more human. "I don't know what came over me. Night shifts do mess with your head sometimes. Let me ring you up." She processed my transaction quickly and efficiently, and I grabbed my items and left, practically running to my truck. My heart pounding and my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. But as I was pulling out of the parking lot, I looked back at the store, and through the window I could see Sharon standing behind the counter again, perfectly still, her face turned toward my departing truck. And even from a distance I could see that she was not blinking. Had never really blinked at all except for that one moment when she wanted me to think she was human, when she was pretending to be what she was not. And I understood that truck stops are way stations not just for living travelers but for other things as well. Things that exist in the liminal spaces where the normal and the paranormal intersect. Things that watch the endless flow of humanity with unblinking eyes and purposes that we cannot comprehend and probably should not want to understand. I never stopped at that particular truck stop again, choosing to drive extra miles to reach different locations, and when other drivers mentioned it, I would casually suggest they might want to avoid the place, though I never explained why. Some of them ignored my advice, of course, and some of them later told me about the strange clerk who never blinked, the woman who stood too still and spoke in ways that made them uncomfortable, and we would exchange knowing looks and say nothing more, understanding that there are some experiences that cannot be adequately explained, some encounters that can only be survived and then avoided in the future, some truck stops where the clerks are not quite what they appear to be, and where the price of goods might include more than whatever appears on your receipt. Story 15. The Exit That Loops. Forever from Rattlesnake Rick highway systems are designed with redundancy and clarity. Multiple routes to reach the same destinations. Signs posted well in advance of turns and exits. Pavement marked with lines and symbols that guide drivers through complex interchanges with minimal confusion. The engineers and planners who create these systems spend years studying traffic patterns and vehicle dynamics, ensuring that the roads function efficiently and safely, that drivers can navigate from one point to another without getting lost or disoriented. But somewhere in the desert Southwest, on a highway that runs through territory so empty and desolate that even the maps seem reluctant to acknowledge its existence, there is an exit that does not follow the normal rules, an off-ramp that leads not to another road or a small town or any kind of destination, but back onto itself, creating a loop that traps drivers in a nightmare of endless repetition. And I know this because I was caught in that loop for what felt like days, but might have been hours or minutes or some other measurement of time that does not translate properly into normal experience. I was running a solo haul from Phoenix to Albuquerque, a route I had driven dozens of times before, when I saw the exit sign appearing out of the heat shimmer that made the distant pavement look like water. The sign was standard issue, green with white lettering, indicating an exit ahead with services available, though the name of the town or rest area was faded beyond legibility, bleached by years of desert sun until only ghost letters remained. I was low on fuel. Not critically so, but enough that I knew I should take advantage of any opportunity to fill up before continuing. And the sign promised gas and food and all the amenities a driver might need. I took the exit, following the off-ramp as it curved away from the main highway, descending slightly as most exits do, creating separation between the through traffic and the local access roads. But as I drove, I began to notice that the off-ramp was longer than it should have been, curving more gradually, extending farther than any normal exit would extend. I kept expecting to see buildings or signs indicating the services that had been promised, but there was nothing. Just empty desert on both sides of the road and the pavement stretching ahead through the scrubland and the heat. After perhaps 2 miles, the road began to curve back in the direction I had come from, and I realized with growing confusion that instead of leading me to a service area or an access road, the exit was actually curving back toward the highway, creating a loop that would deposit me right back where I had started. It was strange but not unprecedented, I told myself. Perhaps the service area was closed, or perhaps I had misread the sign, and this was simply an emergency vehicle turnaround rather than a proper exit. I would just complete the loop and get back on the highway and find fuel at the next opportunity. But when I completed the curve and expected to merge back onto the main highway, I found myself instead entering another exit, one that looked identical to the first, with the same faded sign and the same promise of services that remained just out of reach. My confusion deepened into concern, and I slowed my truck to a crawl, trying to understand the geometry of what I was experiencing. How could an exit lead to another exit? Where was the highway that I had left? Where were the landmarks and signs that should have oriented me and helped me understand my location? I continued on, having no choice really, unable to reverse a 40-foot truck on a single-lane road with no shoulder and no turnaround space. And the second exit behaved exactly like the first, curving gradually through the empty desert and then looping back toward what should have been the highway, but was instead another exit, identical in every respect to the previous two. A cold fear began to settle in my chest, the kind of fear that comes not from immediate danger but from the slow realization that something is fundamentally wrong, that the basic rules and structures you have relied upon your entire life are not functioning the way they should. I counted the loops as I drove them, marking them mentally 3, 4, 5, each one identical, each one promising escape but delivering only continuation, more pavement and more desert, and more of the same faded signs that offered services that did not exist. My fuel gauge, which had shown a quarter tank when I first took the exit, now showed less than an eighth, and I began to calculate how many more loops I could complete before my truck ran out of diesel, and I was stranded in this impossible place with no cell phone signal and no hope of rescue. 6 loops, 7 loops, 8 loops, and the sun that had been high overhead when I entered the exit was now moving toward the horizon, shadows lengthening across the desert floor, and I realized that hours had passed, more hours than should have been possible, given the length of each loop and the speed I was maintaining. Time itself seemed to be behaving strangely here, expanding and contracting in ways that made no sense, and I began to wonder if I had somehow driven out of the normal world entirely, had crossed some invisible boundary into a space where the laws of physics and geography and causality no longer applied. On the 9th loop, I saw another vehicle ahead of me, the first sign of life I had encountered since entering this nightmare. It was a car, small and old, creeping along at perhaps 20 miles per hour, and as I drew closer, I could see that the driver was an elderly man, hunched over the steering wheel, his face set in an expression of weary resignation. I honked my horn, trying to get his attention, hoping that he might know something about this place and how to escape it, but he did not respond, did not even glance in his mirrors, just continued driving at that same slow, steady pace. I pulled alongside him, matching his speed, and looked over at his car. The paint was faded almost white, the tires were nearly bald, and through the window I could see that the interior was filled with trash and belongings, as if he had been living in that vehicle for a very long time. He turned to look at me finally, and I saw that his eyes were empty, completely devoid of hope or emotion or any kind of human spark, and I understood in that moment that he had been driving this loop for far longer than I had, perhaps for years or decades or possibly forever, trapped in this endless circuit with no escape and no end. I accelerated, pulling ahead of him, desperate to find some way out before I became like him, before the repetition and the isolation and the impossible geometry of this place stripped away everything that made me human and left only a shell going through the motions of driving long after the purpose had been forgotten. And on the 10th loop I saw something different, not a sign or a building or an actual exit, but a place where the pavement seemed to shimmer and distort, where reality appeared thin and permeable, like a membrane that might be penetrated if approached at the right angle with the right intention. I did not think, did not calculate or plan, just turned my wheel sharply and aimed my truck directly at that shimmer, expecting to crash into a barrier, or to discover that it was just another mirage created by heat and desperation. But instead my truck passed through, and I felt a sensation like falling through ice water, a shock of cold and pressure that squeezed my entire body. And then I was back on the main highway, driving eastbound as if I had never left. with other vehicles around me and normal traffic patterns and the blessed familiarity of a world that made sense. I pulled over at the first real exit I came to, shaking and gasping, and checked my fuel gauge. It showed exactly a quarter tank, the same level it had shown when I first took that cursed exit, as if no time had passed at all, as if the entire experience had been compressed into a single moment, despite feeling like hours or days of endless repetition. My odometer had not changed. My clock showed the correct time, and there was no physical evidence that anything unusual had occurred. But I know what I experienced, and I know that somewhere in the empty desert there is an exit that loops forever, trapping the unwary and the unlucky in a geometric impossibility, a road to nowhere that somehow leads back to itself in perpetual recursion. And somewhere on that loop an old man is still driving and will always be driving, unable to escape or to stop or to do anything but continue following that same curved path through the heat and the emptiness, forever and ever. Amen. Story 16. The frozen handprint on my windshield. From frosty Fred winter driving is perhaps the most challenging and dangerous work a trucker can undertake. Navigating roads that become ice rinks without warning, dealing with equipment failures caused by extreme cold, and managing the thousand small details that mean the difference between arriving safely and becoming another statistic in the annual toll of weather-related accidents. I had been driving through winters for more than 25 years, had developed the skills and instincts necessary to survive the worst that the northern states could throw at me, and I thought I had seen every kind of cold weather phenomenon that the laws of physics could produce. But on a January night in North Dakota, when the temperature had dropped to 40 below zero and the wind was howling across the frozen prairie with enough force to rock my truck on its springs, I discovered that there are some marks left by the cold that cannot be explained by meteorology or thermodynamics. Handprints that appear on glass without any hand to make them, evidence of contact from something that should not exist in temperatures so extreme that exposed skin freezes in minutes and normal life becomes impossible. I had been driving since before dawn, hauling a load of frozen goods that needed to reach Minneapolis by the following afternoon, and the weather was getting progressively worse as the day wore on, temperatures dropping and wind picking up until I was fighting just to keep my truck in my lane. The highway was mostly empty, only the most foolhardy or desperate drivers venturing out in these conditions, and I was questioning my own judgment for being among them, wondering if I should have just parked somewhere and waited for the storm to pass rather than pushing on through conditions that were rapidly approaching lethal. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, I pulled into a rest area to check my truck and trailer, make sure that nothing was freezing or breaking or coming loose in the brutal cold. The rest area was deserted, just a few picnic tables buried under snowdrifts and a small brick building housing restrooms that were probably frozen solid and unusable. I climbed down from my cab, the cold hitting me like a physical blow despite my heavy coat and insulated boots, and I quickly made my inspection, anxious to get back inside where it was warm and I could protect myself from the wind that was trying to flay the skin from my face. Everything seemed fine with the truck and trailer, no obvious problems, and I was about to climb back into the cab when I noticed something on my windshield. It was a handprint, clear and distinct, the kind of mark that might be left by someone pressing their palm against the glass, fingers spread wide. But the print was not on the outside of the windshield where it would make sense, where someone might have touched the glass while walking past or while trying to get my attention. Instead, it was on the inside, clearly visible from where I stood, as if someone had been sitting in my cab and had pressed their hand against the windshield from within. But that was impossible. My cab had been locked the entire time I was inspecting my vehicle, and there were no other vehicles in the rest area. No other people visible anywhere in that frozen wasteland. I opened the door and climbed up, examining the handprint more closely, and what I saw made my blood run even colder than the temperature outside. The print was not made of oil or sweat or any normal residue that a living hand might leave. Instead, it appeared to be made of frost, as if someone with skin cold enough to freeze moisture on contact had pressed their palm against the inside of my windshield, leaving behind a perfect imprint in ice crystals that should not have been able to form on the inside of a heated cab. I reached out to touch the print, but stopped myself before making contact. Some instinct warning me that touching it would be a mistake, that whatever had left this mark was not something I wanted to establish a connection with. The frost glittered in the dim light from my dome lamp, beautiful and intricate and utterly wrong, and as I stared at it, I began to notice details that made the situation even more disturbing. The handprint was too large to be from an adult human, the fingers too long and too thin, and the palm showed lines and patterns that did not match human anatomy, whorls and ridges that seemed to form symbols or letters in an alphabet I did not recognize. I started my engine and cranked the heater to maximum, hoping that the warmth would melt the frost and erase this impossible mark, but the handprint remained unchanged, as if it was immune to heat, as if it existed in some state where temperature had no meaning or effect. The cab grew warmer, condensation forming on the other windows, but the handprint stayed crisp and clear, mocking my attempts to explain it away or remove it through normal means. Then I heard the tapping. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of the heater and the wind outside, but it grew progressively louder, more insistent, and I realized with sick certainty that something was tapping on my windshield from the outside, directly over the frozen handprint on the inside. I looked through the glass, trying to see what was making the sound, but the darkness outside was absolute. No moon visible through the clouds, no light from any source except my own headlights reflecting off the blowing snow. The tapping continued, developing a rhythm almost like a code or a message, and I began to see movement in the darkness beyond my windshield, shadows shifting in ways that suggested form and purpose. Something out there in the killing cold, something that wanted my attention, or wanted entry, or wanted something I could not begin to guess. My hand moved toward the gear shift, preparing to put the truck in drive and flee this place, but I froze as another handprint appeared on the windshield. This one forming right before my eyes, frost crystallizing out of nothing to create another too large palm and two long fingers pressed against the glass from within. And then another, and another, handprints appearing all across my windshield, on my side windows, even on the roof of my cab. The sound of tapping surrounding me from all directions, dozens or perhaps hundreds of hands pressing against my truck from some impossible space that existed neither inside nor outside, but somehow both, leaving their frozen marks as evidence of contact from something that should not be able to touch or be touched, something native to cold so extreme that it becomes a state of existence rather than simply a measure of temperature. I sat there paralyzed, unable to move or think or do anything but watch as the handprints multiplied, covering every surface of glass in my cab, layer upon layer of frozen palm prints overlapping and obscuring each other until I could no longer see out, until I was entombed in a cocoon of impossible ice and the tapping had become a thunder that shook my entire vehicle. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The tapping ceased, the sense of presence vanished, and I was alone again in my truck, surrounded by silence and the gradually fading frost that began, finally, to respond to the heat from my cab, melting away and running down the glass in rivulets that looked disconcertingly like tears. Within 10 minutes, all evidence of the handprints was gone, leaving only wet glass and my own terrified reflection staring back at me. And I sat there for a long time, engine running, heater blasting, trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was some kind of hallucination, brought on by the extreme cold, or by fatigue, or by some combination of factors that had temporarily affected my perceptions. But I could not quite believe that explanation, could not quite dismiss the memory of those two large hands and two long fingers, that sense of something ancient and alien and intimately connected with the killing cold that humans fear and try to protect themselves against but can never truly escape. Left that rest area and drove straight through to Minneapolis without stopping again, and I have never returned to that particular location, never taken that route through North Dakota during winter, choosing instead to add hundreds of miles to my journeys rather than risk another encounter, with whatever leaves frozen handprints on windshields, whatever waits in the spaces where cold becomes so extreme that it transcends mere weather and becomes a presence, a force, perhaps even a form of life that exists in temperatures where human life cannot survive and human understanding cannot follow. Story 17. The shadow that walked beside my rig from gear shift. Glenn, there is a loneliness that comes from driving through the night that most people who have not experienced it cannot fully understand. A profound isolation that settles into your bones and makes you question your place in the universe. Makes you wonder if you are the only conscious being left in a world that has fallen asleep and forgotten you exist. I had been driving solo routes for nearly 18 years, and I thought I had made peace with that loneliness, had learned to embrace the solitude as a kind of meditation, a space where thoughts could unfold without interruption, and the mind could wander through territories it never accessed during the busy chaos of daylight hours. But on a moonless night in Montana, driving through territory so empty and vast that it felt like the edge of the world itself, I discovered that sometimes loneliness attracts company, that the empty spaces we create around ourselves can be filled by things we never invited and never wanted, shadows that walk beside us through the darkness and refuse to be left behind. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon unfurling toward infinity, no other vehicles visible in either direction, for as far as my headlights could reach, and I had been driving for 7 hours without encountering another soul. Just endless pavement and endless sky, and the steady rumble of my diesel engine providing the only evidence that time was still moving forward. The radio had lost all its stations an hour back, leaving nothing but static and the occasional fragment of distant broadcasts that faded in and out like ghosts trying to communicate across impossible distances. I had turned it off eventually, preferring silence to the frustration of almost signals that never resolved into anything coherent or meaningful. That was when I first noticed the shadow. It appeared in my peripheral vision, keeping pace with my truck on the right side, visible when I glanced at my passenger mirror, but disappearing when I turned my head to look directly at the space beside me. At first I thought it was just a trick of the darkness, my eyes creating patterns and shapes out of nothing, the way humans are programmed to do, finding faces in clouds and meaning in randomness. But the shadow persisted, maintaining its position exactly parallel to my cab, moving at precisely my speed regardless of whether I accelerated or slowed down, and gradually I began to understand that I was seeing something real, something that existed independently of my perception, even if I could not quite bring it into focus. I tried to dismiss it, tried to focus on the road ahead and ignore the presence I could sense rather than see. But ignoring it became increasingly difficult as the miles passed and the shadow remained constant, never falling behind or pulling ahead, just there beside me like a companion I had never asked for and did not want. The sensation was unnerving, that feeling of being accompanied when I should have been alone, and I found myself checking the passenger mirror compulsively, trying to catch a clearer glimpse of whatever was keeping pace with my truck. The shadow had form. I realized more than just a dark shape, but something with structure and substance. Tall and elongated, moving with a gait that suggested legs and arms, and a body arranged in roughly human proportions, but somehow wrong in ways I could not articulate. It walked rather than floated, each stride matching the rotation of my wheels, as if it was physically connected to my truck's motion, tethered by invisible chains or by some bond that went beyond simple coincidence. I decided to test it, to see if the shadow would respond to my actions or simply continue its mechanical pacing. I slowed my truck dramatically, dropping from 65 miles per hour to 40, and the shadow slowed as well, maintaining that perfect parallel position. I accelerated back up to 70, pushing my truck harder than was probably wise given the darkness and the unknown condition of the road ahead, and the shadow kept pace, its stride lengthening to match my increased speed, never falling behind or showing any sign of effort or strain. My heart was hammering now, fear beginning to override curiosity, and I looked for some way to escape this impossible companion. Some action I could take that would break whatever connection had been established between my truck and this thing that walked beside it. I considered pulling over, stopping completely to see if the shadow would continue on without me, or if it would stop as well. But something deep in my lizard brain screamed against that idea, warned me that stopping would be a mistake, that motion was safety and stillness was surrender, and that if I stopped moving, I might never move again. The moon rose eventually, a sliver of silver breaking the horizon and casting faint illumination across the landscape. And in that pale light I could see the shadow more clearly, could make out details that had been invisible in the absolute darkness. It was tall, far taller than any human, perhaps 9 or 10 feet from the ground to the top of what might have been its head. And its limbs were thin and spindly, impossibly long, bending in too many places as it walked. But the most disturbing feature was its lack of features, the complete absence of anything that might be called a face or sensory organs, or any means of perceiving the world around it. Where a head should have been, there was only smooth darkness, featureless and blank, and yet I felt certain that it was aware of me, that it knew I was watching it just as surely as I knew it was watching me. Then it turned toward me. The shadow that had been walking parallel to my truck suddenly rotated, that featureless head orienting directly toward my cab, and I felt the weight of its attention like a physical pressure, like invisible hands pressing against my chest and making it difficult to breathe. And for the first time since it had appeared, it broke the perfect parallel, moving closer to my truck, crossing the distance between us with strides that covered impossible ground, each step bringing it nearer until it was right beside my door, so close that I should have been able to reach out the window and touch it if I had been insane enough to try. I could hear it now, or thought I could, a sound like wind through hollow spaces, like breath drawn through passages that were never meant to carry air, and beneath that a whisper that might have been words or might have been something else, syllables in a language that predated human speech or perhaps had never been human at all. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I began to understand fragments, pieces of meaning that assembled themselves in my mind like a puzzle I had not asked to solve. It was telling me its story, or perhaps showing me images flooding my consciousness that I could not block or filter, visions of roads that stretched across centuries rather than miles, of travelers who had come before me and travelers who would come after, all of them walking or driving or moving through darkness that was older than the stars and would persist long after they burned out. The shadow was not a creature or a spirit or anything that could be categorized in human terms, but rather a manifestation of the road itself, an embodiment of the loneliness and isolation that every traveler carries with them, given form and presence by the accumulated weight of countless solitary journeys. It fed on that loneliness, drew sustenance from the empty spaces between human connections, and it walked beside travelers not to harm them but simply to acknowledge them, to remind them that they were not truly alone even when they believed themselves to be, that the darkness always held company for those willing or unwilling to perceive it. And having been seen, having been acknowledged by my conscious attention, it had become more real, more solid, more present in my reality than it had been before I noticed it. The only way to make it leave, I understood with sudden clarity, was to no longer be lonely, to fill the empty space beside me with something that belonged to the human world, something warm and living and incompatible with the shadow's cold presence. I grabbed my cell phone, which had been lying useless on the passenger seat for hours in this area with no signal, and I called the first number in my contacts. My sister, who lived 2,000 miles away and who I had not spoken to in months because life and distance and the demands of work had created a gulf between us that seemed impossible to cross. The call should not have connected. There was no signal here, no towers anywhere within range of my location. But my phone showed bars suddenly, impossibly, and it rang and she answered, her voice thick with sleep but present, real, human. I talked to her, told her I was sorry for the silence, sorry for the distance, told her about my route and my job, and asked about her children and her husband and the 1,000 small details of a life I had become disconnected from through my own choices and my own embrace of solitude. And as I talked, As I filled the cab of my truck with human words and human connection, and the warmth of a relationship that existed beyond the boundaries of the immediate moment, the shadow began to fade. I could see it withdrawing in my mirror, becoming less distinct, less present, stepping away from my truck and falling behind, released from whatever bond my loneliness had created. By the time my sister and I said goodbye 20 minutes later, the shadow was gone completely, vanished back into whatever space it inhabited, when not called forth by the isolation of nighttime travelers, and I was alone again, but somehow less lonely, connected by invisible threads to the world I had been driving through rather than simply passing across its surface. I never saw the shadow again, though I sometimes felt its presence on particularly long and lonely drives, a reminder lurking at the edge of perception that would not manifest as long as I maintained some connection to the human world beyond my truck. And I learned to carry that connection with me, to check in with family and friends more regularly, to stop for conversations with other drivers at truck stops, to maintain the small social bonds that make loneliness less attractive to the things that feed on it, the shadows that walk beside our rigs and wait patiently for us to acknowledge them and invite them fully into our reality. Story 18. The baby crying from my empty trailer, from Hall Road, Harry Certain. Sounds carry emotional weight beyond their acoustic properties, triggering responses so deep and primal that they bypass rational thought and tap directly into instincts we share with our earliest ancestors. Sounds that demand attention and action regardless of context or circumstance. Among the most powerful of these is the cry of a baby, a sound that evolution has crafted to be impossible to ignore, to penetrate walls and distance and the barriers we erect around ourselves, compelling us to investigate and respond even when logic tells us the sound cannot be real, or cannot be coming from where it appears to originate. I learned about this power on a winter afternoon when I was hauling an empty trailer back from a delivery in Idaho, deadheading through the mountains with nothing but air behind me, and I began to hear a baby crying from inside my trailer, a sound so clear and so distressed that every fiber of my being demanded I stop and investigate, even though I knew with absolute certainty that my trailer was empty and that whatever was making that sound could not possibly be a real human child in need of help. The cry started so faintly that I almost missed it beneath the road noise and engine rumble, just a thin wail that could have been mistaken for wind whistling through a gap in my trailer's seal, or some piece of equipment vibrating at a particular frequency. But it grew steadily louder over the course of several minutes, developing the unmistakable cadence and quality of an infant in distress, that rhythmic rising and falling that speaks of hunger or pain or fear, sounds designed by millions of years of evolution to provoke an immediate caregiving response in any adult within earshot. I checked my mirrors, looking back at my trailer as if I might somehow be able to see through the metal walls and confirm what I already knew, that the trailer was empty, had been empty since I closed and sealed the doors at the delivery dock 6 hours earlier. But the crying continued, growing more urgent, more desperate, and my hands began to shake on the steering wheel as conflicting imperatives warred within my mind. Logic said there could not be a baby in my trailer, that the sound must be coming from somewhere else or must be some kind of auditory hallucination produced by fatigue or stress. But instinct, that ancient programming that cares nothing for logic or probability, screamed at me to stop immediately, to open the trailer and save the child that was clearly dying back there, abandoned or trapped or injured in ways I could not imagine. I pulled over at the first safe spot, a wide shoulder on a curve that offered a view of the valley below, and I sat there for a long moment with the engine idling, listening to the cry that came clearly now from behind me, from inside the trailer, muffled by the metal walls but unmistakably present and unmistakably real. My breath was coming fast and shallow, adrenaline flooding my system, preparing me for action even though I had not yet decided what that action would be. Every instinct demanded I open the trailer immediately, but some small voice of reason whispered that this was wrong, that something about this situation did not make sense, that I should think carefully before acting on impulses I did not fully understand. But the crying continued, and with it came a new sound. The sound of small fists pounding weakly against metal. A baby trying to get attention, trying to signal its location, trying to be found and rescued before it was too late. I could not ignore that. Whatever was happening, whatever impossible circumstances had led to this moment, I could not simply drive away while a child cried for help behind me. I climbed down from my cab and walked to the back of my trailer, my boots crunching on gravel, and I stood there with my hand on the door handle, preparing to unlock and open it, preparing to see what waited inside. The crying stopped. Just ceased instantly in the middle of a wail, cut off as abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch or as if whatever was making the sound had achieved its purpose and no longer needed to continue the performance. I stood there in sudden silence, my hand still on the handle, and every nerve in my body screamed at me not to open that door, not to see what was inside, to get back in my truck and drive away as fast as the law and my engine would allow. But I had come this far, had committed to the action, and backing down now felt like cowardice, like abandoning a child who might actually need help despite all the evidence suggesting otherwise. I turned the handle and opened the door, and the interior of my trailer was revealed in the afternoon light, completely empty as I knew it would be. Just bare metal walls and a floor that showed the scuff marks and stains from thousands of loads but contained nothing living, nothing that could have made the sounds I had heard so clearly. I climbed up into the trailer, walking its length, checking every corner and every surface, looking for any explanation for what I had heard. There were no animals, no equipment, no hidden spaces where something could be concealed. The trailer was empty, objectively and obviously empty, and yet the feeling of presence was overwhelming, as if I was standing in a room full of people I could not see, as if the air itself was crowded with invisible witnesses to my investigation. And then I felt it, a sensation like cold fingers brushing against the back of my neck, and I heard a whisper so quiet I almost missed it. A woman's voice speaking words I could not quite make out, but that carried the unmistakable tone of a lullaby. A mother singing to a child trying to soothe it to sleep. The temperature in the trailer dropped dramatically, my breath becoming visible in clouds, and frost began to form on the metal walls despite the relatively mild weather outside. I backed toward the door, my earlier courage evaporating in the face of this tangible wrongness, and as I moved I began to see them, transparent and flickering like images projected on smoke. A woman and a baby materializing in the center of the trailer. The woman was young, perhaps 25, dressed in clothes from another era, maybe the 1970s or early 80s, and she was cradling an infant wrapped in a blanket, rocking gently, humming that wordless lullaby. Her face was peaceful, loving, showing no awareness that she was dead, no recognition that she and her child were ghosts manifesting in the back of a truck trailer. On a mountain road, far from wherever they had lived and died, I stood transfixed, unable to move or speak, watching this impossible scene unfold before me, and gradually the story assembled itself in my mind, drawn from the images and the emotions that radiated from these spirits like heat from a fire. They had been hitchhikers, the woman and her baby, picked up by a trucker who had seemed kind at first but had proven to be a monster. Someone who had attacked and killed them and hidden their bodies in his trailer, driving across state lines with his terrible cargo, eventually disposing of the evidence in ways that ensured they were never found, never identified, never properly mourned or laid to rest, and their spirits had remained attached to trailers like the one where they had died, moving from truck to truck as equipment was sold and repurposed, manifesting occasionally to drivers who passed through certain areas or who were receptive to their presence, crying out in hopes that someone would hear them, would acknowledge them, would somehow bring justice or peace to deaths that had gone unpunished and unmourned for decades. "I hear you," I said quietly, my voice sounding strange in the cold air. "I see you. I acknowledge what happened to you, and I am sorry that no one helped you when you needed help. Sorry that you died afraid and alone and forgotten." The woman looked up at me for the first time, her eyes meeting mine across the distance that separated the living from the dead. and I saw in them such profound gratitude, such relief at finally being seen and acknowledged after years of invisibility, that I felt tears streaming down my face without shame or embarrassment. She smiled, and the baby in her arms stopped crying, settling into peaceful sleep, and then they both began to fade, becoming less distinct, less present, dissolving into light that grew brighter and warmer until I had to close my eyes against it. When I opened them again, the trailer was empty and normal, the temperature returning to ambient, no trace of frost or presence or anything to suggest that I had witnessed anything out of the ordinary. I climbed down and closed the trailer door, and I drove away from that place with a strange mixture of emotions, sadness for the tragedy I had witnessed and relief that I had been able to provide some small comfort, some acknowledgement of their suffering and their existence. And I reported what I had experienced to the company, told them about the ghosts in the trailer, though I knew they would not believe me, knew that they would attribute my story to stress or imagination or some kind of breakdown, but that trailer was retired soon after, pulled from service for reasons that were never fully explained, and I like to think that my report, however it was received, contributed to that decision, that somewhere in the corporate hierarchy, someone understood that some equipment carries too much history, too much pain, too much unresolved tragedy to continue being used, that some trailers should be laid to rest along with the spirits that haunt them. And I never forgot the baby crying from my empty trailer, or the mother who cradled it, or the reminder that the innocent can suffer terribly at the hands of monsters who wear human faces, and that sometimes the only thing we can offer the dead is acknowledgement. The simple act of seeing them and saying that we know they existed, they mattered, and they deserved better than the fate that was forced upon them. Story 19. The Motel Room That Knew My Name from Roadhouse. Ron, there is a particular exhaustion that comes from too many hours behind the wheel. A weariness so complete that the prospect of sleeping in your truck's cramped sleeper berth becomes intolerable, and the only solution is to splurge on a motel room where you can stretch out properly and shower and enjoy a few hours of privacy and comfort before returning to the road. Most truckers know the major chains, the reliable brands that offer predictable quality and reasonable prices. But sometimes you find yourself in territory where those familiar names are absent, and you take a chance on an independent motel that might be wonderful, or might be a nightmare, but at least offers a bed and four walls and the illusion of normalcy. I took such a chance on a humid summer night in Louisiana, pulling into the parking lot of a motel that advertised rooms and color television and air conditioning, the holy trinity of road lodging. And what I found there taught me that some buildings have memories, that walls absorb the identities of everyone who passes through them, and that privacy is an illusion when you sleep in a room that knows more about you than you know about yourself. The motel was old, built probably in the 1950s or 60s based on the architecture and the faded aesthetic, a single-story structure arranged in an L shape around a parking lot that had more potholes than pavement. The neon sign out front flickered erratically, some letters illuminated and others dark, spelling out a name I could not quite decipher in the gathering dusk. But there was a vacancy and the price was reasonable, and the clerk who checked me in seemed normal enough. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes who took my credit card and handed me a physical key attached to a large plastic tag, the kind of old-fashioned setup that had mostly disappeared in favor of magnetic key cards and computerized systems. "Room 12, she said, pointing toward the far end of the building. "Nice quiet room, end unit. You should sleep well there." I thanked her and drove my truck to the space in front of room 12. Noting that the parking lot was mostly empty, only 2 other vehicles visible, which suggested either that business was slow or that this was not a particularly popular establishment. But I was too tired to care, too desperate for a real bed and a hot shower to question my choice or look for alternatives. The room was what I expected, dated but clean enough, with a double bed covered in a floral bedspread that had probably been installed decades ago, a small television bolted to a dresser, and a bathroom with fixtures that showed their age but appeared functional. I dropped my bag on the bed and headed straight for the shower, letting hot water wash away the grime and fatigue of the road. And when I emerged, I felt almost human again, ready to sleep for 8 uninterrupted hours before continuing my journey. I was drying off when I noticed the photographs on the wall, something I had not registered when I first entered the room. There were perhaps a dozen of them, arranged in a neat grid above the dresser, black and white images in cheap frames showing people from various eras, men and women and children, all posed in formal settings that suggested important occasions or commemorative purposes. I moved closer, curious about this odd decorating choice, wondering why a motel room would be decorated with what appeared to be family photographs, rather than the generic art that usually filled such spaces. And then I saw my own face looking back at me from one of the photographs. Not a similar face, not someone who resembled me, but actually me. Unmistakably me. Younger by perhaps 15 years, but clearly identifiable as myself. I was standing in front of a truck, smiling at the camera, wearing a company uniform from a job I had held more than a decade ago. A photograph that should not exist because I did not remember it being taken. Did not remember anyone photographing me in those circumstances. My hands began to shake as I moved along the wall, examining the other photographs more closely, and I found myself in 3 more of them. In one, I was a child, perhaps 10 years old, standing between 2 adults I did not recognize in front of a house I had never seen. In another, I was older, maybe in my 30s, dressed formally in a suit I knew I had never owned, standing in what appeared to be a church or wedding venue. And in the third, I was elderly, far older than my current age, my face lined and weathered, sitting in a wheelchair in some institutional setting, with the look of someone who had reached the end of their journey and was simply waiting for it to be officially concluded. The room suddenly felt wrong. The air too thick, the walls too close, and I understood with creeping horror that these were not random photographs but something else. Some record or prediction or documentation of my life and the lives of everyone who had ever stayed in this room. Images captured from past and future and alternative possibilities, all displayed like trophies or specimens or warnings of what has been and what might be. The motel room knew me, knew my name and my history and my possible futures, and it was showing me evidence of that knowledge, asserting a claim over my identity that I had never granted and did not know how to revoke. I reached for the photograph that showed me as a child, intending to take it off the wall and examine it more closely. But the moment my fingers touched the frame, I was overwhelmed by sensation. Memories flooding my consciousness that were both mine and not mine. Experiences I had lived and experiences I might live, and experiences from timelines that had branched away from my own in moments of choice and chance. I saw myself taking different jobs, making different decisions, living different lives. And in all of them I ended up here, in this room, in this motel, as if this place was a nexus point where all possible versions of my life converged, where the multiverse collapsed into a single moment and a single location. I jerked my hand away from the photograph, breaking the connection, and staggered backward until I hit the bed and sat down hard, my breath coming in gasps. The television turned on by itself, the screen showing static at first and then resolving into images. Home movies or security footage or something else, scenes from my life that I recognized and scenes I did not, all playing in rapid succession like a highlight reel or an accusation or a promise of things to come. I saw myself as a baby, learning to walk. I saw my first day of school. I saw my first truck, my first accident, my first love, and my first heartbreak. I saw moments of triumph and moments of despair. Saw choices I had made and roads I had not taken. Saw myself young and old and sick and healthy and happy and miserable and alive and dead. And through it all, through every scene and every moment, there was this room, this motel room, appearing in the background or reflected in mirrors or visible through windows. Always present, always watching, documenting everything and offering it back to me in a display that was simultaneously intimate and violating. "What do you want from me?" I shouted at the room, at the walls, at whatever presence or intelligence animated this place. Why are you showing me this? What am I supposed to do with this information? The television went dark, and the photographs on the wall began to fade, the images becoming transparent and then disappearing entirely, leaving only empty frames hanging on the wall. And then I heard it. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls themselves or from inside my own head, words that formed in my consciousness without passing through my ears. "We collect," the voice said, and it sounded like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, men and women and children, everyone who had ever stayed in this room adding their voice to a chorus that transcended individual identity. "We remember. We preserve. Every person who sleeps here leaves something behind, imprints on the walls and the air and the spaces between, and we keep those imprints, treasure them, maintain them so that nothing is truly lost, so that no life passes through without leaving a mark. You are part of the collection now, part of the record, and whenever you need to remember who you are or who you might have been, you can return here and we will show you everything. All the versions of yourself that exist or existed or might exist, preserved forever in this room that knows your name." I grabbed my bag and fled, not bothering to check out or explain my departure, just running to my truck and driving away from that place as fast as I could manage without attracting police attention. And I never went back, never returned to that motel or that town or even that state if I could avoid it, taking routes that added hundreds of miles to my journeys, rather than risk passing close to that building that collected lives like some people collect stamps or coins, that knew too much and remembered too well and offered knowledge that no human should possess. But sometimes, late at night when sleep will not come and I lie in other motel rooms or in my truck's sleeper berth, I think about room 12 and the photographs on its wall, and I wonder what other images have been added since I left. What other versions of my life are being recorded and preserved by whatever force or consciousness inhabits that space. And I am grateful and terrified in equal measure. Grateful that somewhere my life is being remembered and preserved. Terrified that somewhere out there is a room that knows me better than I know myself, that sees all my possible paths and holds them like cards in a cosmic game, whose rules I have never been taught, and whose stakes I cannot begin to imagine.